Book 6, Chapter 1 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 6, Doña Isabella. Chapter 1, Don Antonio. Bishop Latour had one very keen worldly ambition, to build in Santa Fe a cathedral which would be worthy of a setting naturally beautiful. As he cherished this wish and meditated upon it, he came to feel that such a building might be a continuation of himself and his purpose, a physical body full of his aspirations after he had passed from the scene. Early in his administration he began setting aside something from his meager resources for a cathedral fund. In this he was assisted by certain of the rich Mexican rancheros, but by no one so much as by Don Antonio Olivares. Antonio Olivares was the most intelligent and prosperous member of a large family of brothers and cousins, and he was for that time and place a man of wide experience, a man of the world. He had spent the greater part of his life in New Orleans and El Paso del Norte, but he returned to live in Santa Fe several years after Bishop Latour took up his duties there. He brought with him his American wife and a wagon train of furniture, and settled down to spend his declining years in the old ranch house just east of the town where he was born and had grown up. He was then a man of 60. In early manhood he had lost his first wife. After he went to New Orleans he had married a second time, a Kentucky girl who had grown up among her relatives in Louisiana. She was pretty and accomplished, had been educated at a French convent, and had done much to Europeanize her husband. The refinement of his dress and manners, and his lavish style of living, provoked half-contemptuous envy among his brothers and their friends. Olivares's wife, Doña Isabella, was a devout Catholic, and at their house the French priests were always welcome, and were most cordially entertained. The Señora Olivares had made a pleasant place of the rambling adobe building, with its great courtyard and gateway, carved joists and beams, fine herringbone ceilings, and snug fireplaces. She was a gracious hostess, and though no longer very young, she was still attractive to the eye, a slight woman, spirited, quick in movement, with a delicate blonde complexion, which she had successfully guarded in trying climates, and fair hair, a little silvered and perhaps worn in too many puffs and ringlets for the sharpening outline of her face. She spoke French well, Spanish lamely, played the harp, and sang agreeably. Certainly it was a great piece of luck for Father Latour and Father Vaillant, who lived so much among peons and Indians and rough frontiersmen, to be able to converse in their own tongue now and then with a cultivated woman, to sit by that hospitable fireside in rooms enriched by old mirrors and engravings and upholstered chairs, where the windows had clean curtains, and the sideboard and cupboards were stocked with plate and Belgian glass. It was refreshing to spend an evening with a couple who were interested in what was going on in the outside world, to eat a good dinner and drink good wine and listen to music. Father Joseph, that man of inconsistencies, had a pleasing tenor voice, true though not strong. Madame Olivares liked to sing old French songs with him. She was a trifle vain, it must be owned, and when she sang at all, insisted upon singing in 3 languages, never forgetting her husband's favorites, La Paloma and La Golondrina, and My Nelly Was a Lady. The Negro melodies of Stephen Foster had already traveled to the frontier, going along the river highways, not in print, but passed on from one humble singer to another. Don Antonio was a large man, heavy, full at the belt, a trifle bald, and very slow of speech. But his eyes were lively, and the yellow spark in them was often most perceptible when he was quite silent. It was interesting to observe him after dinner, settled in one of his big chairs from New Orleans, a cigar between his long golden-brown fingers, watching his wife at her harp. There was gossip about the lady in Santa Fe, of course, since she had retained her beautiful complexion and her husband's devoted regard for so many years. The Americans and the Olivares brothers said she dressed much too youthfully, which was perhaps true, and that she had lovers in New Orleans and El Paso del Norte. Her nephews-in-law went so far as to declare that she was enamored of the Mexican boy the Olivares had brought up from San Antonio to play the banjo for them. They both loved music, and this boy, Pablo, was a magician with his instrument. All sorts of stories went out from the kitchen that Doña Isabella had a whole chamber full of dresses so grand that she never wore them here at all, that she took gold from her husband's pockets and hid it under the floor of her room, that she gave him love potions and herb teas to increase his ardor. This gossip did not mean that her servants were disloyal, but rather that they were proud of their mistress. Olivares, who read the newspapers, though they were weeks old when he got them, who liked cigars better than cigarettes, and French wine better than whiskey, had little in common with his younger brothers. Next to his old friend Manuel Chavez, the two French priests were the men in Santa Fe whose company he most enjoyed, and he let them see it. He was a man who cherished his friends. He liked to call at the bishop's house to advise him about the care of his young orchard, or to leave a bottle of homemade cherry brandy for Father Joseph. It was Olivares who presented Father Latour with the silver hand-basin and pitcher and toilet accessories, which gave him so much satisfaction all the rest of his life. There were good silversmiths among the Mexicans of Santa Fe, and Don Antonio had his own toilet set, copied in hammered silver for his friend. Doña Isabella once remarked that her husband always gave Father Vaillant something good for the palate, and Father Latour something good for the eye. This couple had one child, a daughter, the Señorita Inés, born long ago and still unmarried. Indeed, it was generally understood that she would never marry. Though she had not taken the veil, her life was that of a nun. She was very plain, and had none of her mother's social graces. But she had a beautiful contralto voice. She sang in the cathedral choir in New Orleans, and taught singing in a convent there. She came to visit her parents only once after they settled in Santa Fe, and she was a somewhat somber figure in that convivial household. Doña Isabella seemed devotedly attached to her, but afraid of displeasing her. While Inés was there, her mother dressed very plainly, pinned back the little curls that hung over her right ear, and the two women went to church together all day long. Antonio Olivares was deeply interested in the bishop's dream of a cathedral. For one thing, he saw that Father Latour had set his heart on building one, and Olivares was the sort of man who liked to help a friend accomplish the desire of his heart. Furthermore, he had a deep affection for his native town. He had traveled and seen fine churches, and he wished there might some day be one in Santa Fe. Many a night he and Father Latour talked of it by the fire, discussed the site, the design, the building stone, the cost, and the grave difficulties of raising money. It was the bishop's hope to begin work upon the building in 1860, 10 years after his appointment to the bishopric. One night, at a long-remembered New Year's party in his house, Olivares announced in the presence of his guests that before the New Year was gone he meant to give to the cathedral fund a sum sufficient to enable Father Latour to carry out his purpose. That supper party at the Olivares was memorable because of this pledge, and because it marked a parting of old friends. Doña Isabella was entertaining the officers at the post, 2 of whom had received orders to leave Santa Fe. The popular commandant was called back to Washington. The young lieutenant of cavalry an Irish Catholic, lately married and very dear to Father Latour, was to be sent farther west. Before the next New Year's Day came round, he was killed in Indian warfare on the plains of Arizona. But that night the future troubled nobody. The house was full of light and music, the air warm with that simple hospitality of the frontier, where people dwell in exile, far from their kindred, where they lead rough lives and seldom meet together for pleasure. Kit Carson, who greatly admired Madame Olivares, had come the 2 days' journey from Taos to be present that night, and brought along his gentle half-breed daughter, lately home from a convent school in St. Louis. On this occasion he wore a handsome buckskin coat, embroidered in silver, with brown velvet cuffs and collar. The officers from the fort were in dress uniform. The host, as usual, wore a broadcloth frock coat. His wife was in a hoop skirt, a French dress from New Orleans, all covered with little garlands of pink satin roses. The military ladies came out to the Olivares place in an army wagon to keep their satin shoes from the mud. The bishop had put on his violet vest, which he seldom wore, and Father Vaillant had donned a fresh new cassock made by the loving hands of his sister Philomena in Riom. Father Latour had used to feel a little ashamed that Joseph kept his sister and her nuns so busy making cassocks and vestments for him. But the last time he was in France, he came to see all this in another light. When he was visiting Mother Philomena's convent, one of the younger sisters had confided to him what an inspiration it was to them, living in retirement, to work for the faraway missions. She told him also how precious to them were Father Vaillant's long letters in which he told his sister of the country, the Indians, the pious Mexican women, the Spanish martyrs of old. These letters, she said, Mother Philomena read aloud in the evening. The nun took Father Latour to a window that jutted out and looked up the narrow street to where the wall turned at an angle, cutting off further view. "Look," she said, "after the mother has read us one of those letters from her brother, I come and stand in this alcove and look up our little street with its one lamp, and just beyond the turn there is New Mexico. All that he has written of us, of those red deserts and blue mountains, the great plains and the herds of bison, and the canyons more profound than our deepest mountain gorges. I can feel that I am there. My heart beats faster, and it seems but a moment until the retiring bell cuts short my dreams." The bishop went away believing that it was good for these sisters to work for Father Joseph. Tonight, when Madame Olivares was complimenting Father Vaillant on the sheen of his poplin and velvet, for some reason Father Latour recalled that moment with the nun in her alcove window, her white face, her burning eyes, and sighed. After supper was over and the toasts had been drunk, the boy Pablo was called in to play for the company while the gentlemen smoked. The banjo always remained a foreign instrument to Father Latour. He found it more than a little savage. When this strange yellow boy played it, there was softness and languor in the wire strings, but there was also a kind of madness, the recklessness, the call of wild countries, which all these men had felt and followed in one way or another. Through clouds of cigar smoke, the scout and the soldiers, the Mexican rancheros and the priests, sat silently watching the bent head and crouching shoulders of the banjo player, and his see-sawing yellow hand, which sometimes lost all form and became a mere whirl of matter in motion, like a patch of sandstorm. Observing them thus in repose, in the act of reflection, Father Latour was thinking how each of these men not only had a story, but seemed to have become his story. Those anxious, far-seeing blue eyes of Carson's, To whom could they belong but to a scout and trail-breaker? Don Manuel Chavez, the handsomest man of the company, very elegant in velvet and broadcloth, with delicately cut, disdainful features. One had only to see him cross the room, or to sit next to him at dinner, to feel the electric quality under his cold reserve, the fierceness of some embitterment, the passion for danger. Chavez boasted his descent from 2 Castilian knights who freed the city of Chavez from the Moors in 1160. He had estates in the Pecos and in the San Mateo Mountains, and a house in Santa Fe, where he hid himself behind his beautiful trees and gardens. He loved the natural beauties of his country with a passion, and he hated the Americans, who were blind to them. He was jealous of Carson's fame as an Indian fighter, declaring that he had seen more Indian warfare before he was 20 than Carson would ever see. He was easily Carson's rival as a pistol shot. With the bow and arrow he had no rival. He had never been beaten. No Indian had ever been known to shoot an arrow as far as Chavez. Every year parties of Indians came up to the villa to shoot with him for wagers. His house and stables were full of trophies. He took a cool pleasure in stripping the Indians of their horses or silver or blankets or whatever they had put up on their man. He was proud of his skill with Indian weapons. He had acquired it in a hard school. When he was a lad of 16, Manuel Chavez had gone out with a party of Mexican youths to hunt Navajos. In those days, before the American occupation, hunting Navajos needed no pretext. It was a form of sport. A company of Mexicans would ride west to the Navajo country, raid a few sheep camps, and come home bringing flocks and ponies and a bunch of prisoners, for every one of whom they received a large bounty from the Mexican government. It was with such a raiding party that the boy Chavez went out for spoil and adventure. Finding no Indians abroad, the young Mexicans pushed on farther than they had intended. They did not know that it was the season when all the roving Navajo bands gather at the Cañon de Che for their religious ceremonies, and they rode on impetuously until they came out upon the rim of that mysterious and terrifying canyon itself, then swarming with Indians. They were immediately surrounded, and retreat was impossible. They fought on the naked sandstone ledges that overhang that gulf. Don José Chavez, Manuel's older brother, was captain of the party, and was one of the first to fall. The company of 50 were slaughtered to a man. Manuel was the 51st, and he survived. With 7 arrow wounds and 1 shaft clear through his body, he was left for dead in a pile of corpses. That night, while the Navajos were celebrating their victory, the boy crawled along the rocks until he had high boulders between him and the enemy, and then started eastward on foot. It was summer, and the heat of that red sandstone country is intense. His wounds were on fire, but he had the superb vitality of early youth. He walked for 2 days and nights without finding a drop of water, covering a distance of 60-odd miles across the plain, across the mountain, until he came to the famous spring on the other side, where Fort Defiance was afterward built. There he drank and bathed his wounds and slept. He had had no food since the morning before the fight. Near the spring he found some large cactus plants, and slicing away the spines with his hunting knife, he filled his stomach with the juicy pulp. From here, still without meeting a human creature, he stumbled on until he reached the San Mateo mountain, north of Laguna. In a mountain valley he came upon a camp of Mexican shepherds, and fell unconscious. The shepherds made a litter of saplings and their sheepskin coats, and carried him into the village of Cebolleta. where he lay delirious for many days. Years afterward, when Chavez came into his inheritance, he bought that beautiful valley in the San Mateo mountain where he had sunk unconscious under 2 noble oak trees. He built a house between those twin oaks and made a fine estate there. Never reconciled to American rule, Chavez lived in seclusion when he was in Santa Fe. At the first rumor of an Indian outbreak, near or far, he rode off to add a few more scalps to his record. He distrusted the new bishop because of his friendliness toward Indians and Yankees. Besides, Chavez was a Martinez man. He had come here tonight only in compliment to Señora Olivares. He hated to spend an evening among American uniforms. When the banjo player was exhausted, Father Joseph said that as for him, he would like a little drawing-room music, and he led Madame Olivares to her harp. She was very charming at her instrument. The pose suited her tip-tilted canary head, and her little foot and white arms. This was the last time the bishop heard her sing La Paloma for her admiring husband, whose eyes smiled at her even when his heavy face seemed asleep. Olivares died on Septuagesima Sunday, fell over by his own fireplace when he was lighting the candles after supper, and the banjo boy was sent running for the bishop. Before midnight, 2 of the Olivares brothers, half drunk with brandy and excitement, galloped out of Santa Fe on the road to Albuquerque to employ an American lawyer. End of Don Antonio. Book 6, Chapter 2 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lady. Antonio Olivares' funeral was the most solemn and magnificent ever seen in Santa Fe. But Father Vaillant was not there. He was off on a long missionary journey to the south, and did not reach home until Madame Olivares had been a widow for some weeks. He had scarcely got off his riding boots when he was called into Father Latour's study to see her lawyer. Olivares had entrusted the management of his affairs to a young Irish Catholic, Boyd O'Reilly, who had come out from Boston to practice law in the new territory. There were no steel safes in Santa Fe at that time, but O'Reilly had kept Olivares' will in his strong-box. The document was brief and clear. Antonio's estate amounted to about $200,000 in American money, a considerable fortune in those days. The income therefrom was to be enjoyed by my wife Isabella Olivares and her daughter Inez Olivares during their lives, and after their decease his property was to go to the church, to the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. The codicil in favor of the cathedral fund had unfortunately never been added to the will. The young lawyer explained to Father Vaillant that the Olivares brothers had retained the leading legal firm of Albuquerque and were contesting the will. Their point of attack was that Señorita Inez was too old to be the daughter of the Señora Olivares. Don Antonio had been a promiscuous lover in his young days, and his brothers held that Inez was the offspring of some temporary attachment and had been adopted by Doña Isabella. O'Reilly had sent to New Orleans for an attested copy of the marriage record of the Olivares couple and the birth certificate of the Señorita Inez. But in Kentucky, where the Señora was born, no birth records were kept. There was no document to prove the age of Isabella Olivares, and she could not be persuaded to admit her true age. It was generally believed in Santa Fe that she was still in her early 40s, in which case she would not have been more than 6 or 8 years old at the date when Inez was born. In reality, the lady was past 50, but when O'Reilly had tried to persuade her to admit this in court, she simply refused to listen to him. He begged the bishop and the vicar to use their influence with her to this end. Father Latour shrank from interfering in so delicate a matter, But Father Vaillant saw at once that it was their plain duty to protect the two women, and at the same time secure the rights of the propaganda. Without more ado, he threw on his old cloak over his cassock, and the three men set off through the red mud to the Olivares hacienda in the hills east of the town. Father Joseph had not been to the Olivares house since the night of the New Year's party, and he sighed as he approached the place, already transformed by neglect. The big gate was propped open by a pole because the iron hook was gone. The courtyard was littered with rags and meat bones, which the dogs had carried there, and no one had taken away. The big parrot cage hanging in the portale was filthy, and the birds were squalling. When O'Reilly rang the bell at the outer gate, Pablo, the banjo player, came running out with tousled hair and a dirty shirt to admit the visitors. He took them into the long living room, which was empty and cold, the fireplace dark, the hearth unswept. Chairs and window-sills were deep in red dust, the glass panes dirty and streaked as if by teardrops. On the writing table were empty bottles and sticky glasses and cigar ends. In one corner stood the harp in its green cover. Pablo asked the fathers to be seated. His mistress was staying in bed, he said, and the cook had burnt her hand, and the other maids were lazy. He brought wood and laid a fire. After some time, Doña Isabella entered, dressed in heavy mourning, her face very white against the black, and her eyes red. The curls about her neck and ears were pale, too, quite ashen. After Father Vaillant had greeted her and spoken consoling words, the young lawyer began once more, gently, to explain to her the difficulties that confronted them, and what they must do to defeat the action of the Olivares family. She sat submissively, touching her eyes and nose with her little lace handkerchief, and clearly not even trying to understand a word of what he said to her. Father Joseph soon lost patience, and himself approached the widow. "You understand, my child," he began briskly, "that your husband's brothers are determined to disregard his wishes, to defraud you and your daughter, and eventually the church. This is no time for childish vanity. To prevent this outrage to your husband's memory, you must satisfy the court that you are old enough to be the mother of Mademoiselle Inez. You must resolutely declare your true age. 53, is it not?" Doña Isabella became pallid with fright. She shrank into one end of the deep sofa, but her blue eyes focused and gathered light as she became intensely, rigidly animated in her corner, her back against the wall, as it were. 53? She cried in a voice of horrified amazement. "Why, I never heard of anything so outrageous. I was 42, my last birthday. It was in December, the 4th of December. If Antonio were here, he would tell you, and he wouldn't let you scold me and talk about business to me either, Father Joseph. He never let anybody talk about business to me." She hid her face in her little handkerchief and began to cry. Father Latour checked his impetuous vicar and sat down on the sofa beside Madame Olivares, feeling very sorry for her and speaking very gently. 42 to your friends, dear Madame Olivares, and to the world. In heart and face you are younger than that. But to the law and the church there must be a literal reckoning. A formal statement in court will not make you any older to your friends. It will not add one line to your face. A woman, you know, is as old as she looks. "That's very sweet of you to say, Bishop Latour," the lady quavered, looking up at him with tear-bright eyes. "But I never could hold up my head again. Let the Olivares have that old money. I don't want it." Father Vaillant sprang up and glared down at her, as if he could put common sense into her drooping head by the mere intensity of his gaze. 400,000 pesos, Señora Isabella, he cried. ease and comfort for you and your daughter all the rest of your lives, would you make your daughter a beggar? The Olivares will take everything." "I can't help it about Inez," she pleaded. "Inez means to go into the convent anyway, and I don't care about the money. Ah, mon père, je voudrais mieux être jeune, être mendiant, que n'être que vieille, être riche, certes, oui." Father Joseph caught her icy cold hand. "And have you a right to defraud the Church of what is left to it in your trust? Have you thought of the consequences to yourself of such a betrayal?" Father Latour glanced sternly at his vicar. "Assez," he said quietly. He took the little hand Father Joseph had released and bent over it, kissing it respectfully. "We must not press this any further. We must leave this to Madame Olivares and her own conscience. I believe, my daughter, you will come to realize that this sacrifice of your vanity would be for your soul's peace. Looking merely at the temporal aspect of the case, you would find poverty hard to bear. You would have to live upon the Olivares' charity, would you not? I do not wish to see this come about. I have a selfish interest. I wish you to be always your charming self, and to make a little poesy in life for us here. We have not much of that." Madame Olivares stopped crying. She raised her head and sat drying her eyes. Suddenly she took hold of one of the buttons on the bishop's cassock and began twisting it with nervous fingers. "Father," she said timidly, "what is the youngest I could possibly be to be Inez's mother?" The bishop could not pronounce the verdict. He hesitated, flushed, then passed it on to O'Reilly with an open gesture of his fine white hand. 52, Senora Olivares," said the young man respectfully. "If I can get you to admit that, and stick to it, I feel sure we will win our case." "Very well, Mr. O'Reilly." She bowed her head. As her visitors rose, she sat looking down at the dust-covered rugs. "Before everybody," she murmured as if to herself. When they were tramping home, Father Joseph said that as for him, he would rather combat the superstitions of a whole Indian pueblo than the vanity of one white woman. "And I would rather do almost anything than go through such a scene again," said the bishop with a frown. "I don't think I ever assisted at anything so cruel." Boyd O'Reilly defeated the Olivares brothers and won his case. The bishop would not go to the court hearing, but Father Vaillant was there, standing in the malodorous crowd. There were no chairs in the courtroom, and his knees shook under him when the young lawyer, with the fierceness born of fright, poked his finger at his client and said, "Senora Olivares, you are 52 years of age, are you not?" Madame Olivares was swathed in mourning, her face a streak of shadowed white between folds of black veil. "Yes, sir." The crape barely let it through. The night after the verdict was pronounced, Manuel Chavez, with several of Antonio's old friends, called upon the widow to congratulate her. Word of their intention had gone about the town and put others in the mood to call at a house that had been closed to visitors for so long. A considerable company gathered there that evening, including some of the military people and several hereditary enemies of the Olivares brothers. The cook, stimulated by the sight of the long sala full of people once more, hastily improvised a supper. Pablo put on a white shirt and a velvet jacket and began to carry up from the cellar his late master's best whiskey and sherry and quarts of champagne. The Mexicans are very fond of sparkling wines. Only a few years before this, an American trader who had got into serious political trouble with the Mexican military authorities in Santa Fe regained their confidence and friendship by presenting them with a large wagon shipment of champagne. 3,392 bottles, indeed. This hospitable mood came upon the house suddenly. Nothing had been prepared beforehand. The wine-glasses were full of dust, but Pablo wiped them out with the shirt he had just taken off, and without instructions from anyone, he began gliding about with a tray full of glasses, which he afterward refilled many times, taking his station at the sideboard. Even Doña Isabella drank a little champagne. When she had sipped one glass with the young Georgia captain, she could not refuse to take another with their nearest neighbor, Ferdinand Sanchez, always a true friend to her husband. Every one was gay, the servants and the guests. Everything sparkled like a garden after a shower. Father Latour and Father Vaillant, having heard nothing of this spontaneous gathering of friends, set off at 8 o'clock to make a call upon the brave widow. When they entered the courtyard, they were astonished to hear music within and to see light streaming from the long row of windows behind the portale. Without stopping to knock, they opened the door into the sala. Many candles were burning. Signors were standing about in long frock coats buttoned over full figures. O'Reilly and a group of officers from the fort surrounded the sideboard, where Pablo, with a white napkin wrapped showily about his wrist, was pouring champagne. From the other end of the room sounded the high tinkle of the harp and Doña Isabella's voice. "Listen to the mockingbird, listen to the mockingbird." The priests waited in the doorway until the song was finished, then went forward to pay their respects to the hostess. She was wearing the unrelieved white that grief permitted, and the yellow curls were bobbing as of old, 3 behind her right ear, 1 over either temple, and a little row across the back of her neck. As she saw the 2 black figures approaching, she dropped her arms from the harp, took her satin toe from the pedal, and rose, holding out a hand to each. Her eyes were bright, and her face beamed with affection for her spiritual fathers. But her greeting was a playful reproach, uttered loud enough to be heard above the murmur of conversing groups. "I never shall forgive you, Father Joseph, nor you either, Bishop Latour, for that awful lie you made me tell in court about my age." The 2 churchmen bowed amid laughter and applause. End of The Lady. Book 7, Chapter 1, Of Death Comes for the Archbishop, by Willa Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 7, The Great Diocese. Chapter 1, The Month of Mary. The bishop's work was sometimes assisted, often impeded, by external events. By the Gadsden Purchase, executed 3 years after Father Latour came to Santa Fe, the United States took over from Mexico a great territory, which now forms southern New Mexico and Arizona. The authorities at Rome notified Father Latour that this new territory was to be annexed to his diocese, but that as the national boundary lines often cut parishes in 2, the boundaries of church jurisdiction must be settled by conference with the Mexican bishops of Chihuahua and Sonora. Such conferences would necessitate a journey of nearly 4,000 miles. As Father Vaillant remarked, at Rome they did not seem to realize that it was no easy matter for 2 missionaries on horseback to keep up with the march of history. The question hung fire for some years, the subject of voluminous correspondence. At last, in 1858, Father Vaillant was sent to arrange the debated boundaries with the Mexican bishops. He started in the autumn and spent the whole winter on the road, going from El Paso del Norte west to Tucson, on to Santa Magdalena and Guaymas, a seaport town on the Gulf of California, and did some seafaring on the Pacific before he turned homeward. On his return trip, he was stricken with malarial fever, resulting from exposure and bad water, and lay seriously ill in a cactus desert in Arizona. Word of his illness came to Santa Fe by an Indian runner, and Father Latour and Jacinto rode across New Mexico and half of Arizona, found Father Vaillant, and brought him back by easy stages. He was ill in the bishop's house for 2 months. This was the first spring that he and Father Latour had both been there at the same time to enjoy the garden they had laid out soon after they first came to Santa Fe. It was the month of Mary and the month of May. Father Vaillant was lying on an army cot covered with blankets under the grape arbor in the garden, watching the bishop and his gardener at work in the vegetable plots. The apple trees were in blossom, the cherry blooms had gone by, the air and the earth interpenetrated in the warm gusts of spring. The soil was full of sunlight, and the sunlight full of red dust. The air one breathed was saturated with earthy smells, and the grass underfoot had a reflection of blue sky in it. This garden had been laid out 6 years ago when the bishop brought his fruit trees, then dry switches, up from St. Louis in wagons, along with the Blessed Sisters of Loretto, who came to found the Academy of Our Lady of Light. The school was now well established, reckoned a benefit to the community by Protestants as well as Catholics, and the trees were bearing. Cuttings from them were already yielding fruit in many Mexican gardens. While the bishop was away on that first trip to Baltimore, Father Joseph had, in addition to his many official duties, found time to instruct their Mexican housekeeper, Fructosa, in cookery. Later, Bishop Latour took in hand Fructosa's husband, Tranquillino, and trained him as a gardener. They had boldly planned for the future. The ground behind the church, between the bishop's house and the academy, they laid out as a spacious orchard and kitchen garden. Ever since then, the bishop had worked on it, planting and pruning. It was his only recreation. A line of young poplars linked the episcopal courtyard with the school. On the south, against the earth wall, was the one row of trees they had found growing there when they first came. Old tamarisks, with twisted trunks. They had been so neglected, left to fight for life in such hard, sun-baked, burro-trodden ground, that their trunks had the hardness of cypress. They looked indeed like very old posts, well seasoned and polished by time, miraculously endowed with the power to burst into delicate foliage and flowers, to cover themselves with long brooms of lavender-pink blossom. Father Joseph had come to love the tamarisk above all trees. It had been the companion of his wanderings, all along his way through the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. Wherever he had come upon a Mexican homestead, out of the sun-baked earth, against the sun-baked adobe walls, the tamarisk waved its feathery plumes of bluish green. The family burro was tied to its trunk, the chickens scratched under it, the dogs slept in its shade, the washing was hung on its branches. Father Latour had often remarked that this tree seemed especially designed in shape and color for the adobe village. The sprays of bloom which adorn it are merely another shade of the red earth walls, and its fibrous trunk is full of gold and lavender tints. Father Joseph respected the bishop's eye for such things, but himself, he loved it merely because it was the tree of the people and was like one of the family in every Mexican household. This was a very happy season for Father Vaillant. For years he had not been able properly to observe this month, which in his boyhood he had selected to be the holy month of the year for him, dedicated to the contemplation of his gracious patroness. In his former missionary life on the Great Lakes, he used always to go into retreat at this season, but here there was no time for such things. Last year, in May, he had been on his way to the Hopi Indians, riding 30 miles a day, marrying, baptizing, confessing as he went, making camp in the sand hills at night. His devotions had been constantly interrupted by practical considerations. But this year, because of his illness, the month of Mary, he had been able to give to Mary. To her he had consecrated his waking hours, At night he sank to sleep with the sense of her protection. In the morning, when he awoke, before he had opened his eyes, he was conscious of a special sweetness in the air. Mary and the month of May, Alma Mater Redemptoris. Once more he had been able to worship with the ardor of a young religious, for whom religion is pure personal devotion, unalloyed by expediency and the benumbing cares of a missionary's work. Once again this had been his month. His patroness had given it to him, the season that had always meant so much in his religious life. He smiled to remember a time long ago when he was a young curate in Cendres, in the Puy-de-Dôme, how he had planned a season of special devotion to the Blessed Virgin for May, and how the old priest, to whom he was assistant, had blasted his hopes by cold disapproval. The old man had come through the terror, had been trained in the austerity of those days of the persecution of the clergy, and he was not untouched by Jansenism. Young Father Joseph bore his rebuke with meekness and went sadly to his own chamber. There he took his rosary and spent the entire day in prayer. "Not according to my desires, but if it is for thy glory, grant me this boon, O Mary, my hope." In the evening of that same day, the old pastor sent for him, and, unsolicited, granted him the request he had so sternly denied in the morning. How joyfully Father Joseph had written all this to his sister Philomena, then a pupil with the nuns of the Visitation in their native realm, begging her to make him a quantity of artificial flowers for his May altar. How richly she had responded! And she rejoiced no less than he that his May devotions were so largely attended, especially by the young people of the parish, in whom a notable increase of piety was manifest. Father Vaillant's had been a close-knit family. Losing their mother while they were yet children had brought the brothers and sisters the closer together, and with this sister, Philomena, he had shared all his hopes and desires and his deepest religious life. Ever since then, all the most important events in his own history had occurred in the blessed month when this sinful and sullied world puts on white, as if to commemorate the Annunciation, and becomes, for a little, lovely enough to be in truth the bride of Christ. It was in May that he had been given grace to perform the hardest act of his life, to leave his country, to part from his dear sister and his father, under what sad circumstances, and to start for the New World to take up a missionary's labors. That parting was not a parting, but an escape, a running away, a betrayal of family trust, for the sake of a higher trust. He could smile at it now, but at the time it had been terrible enough. The bishop, thinning carrots yonder, would remember. It was because of what Father Latour had been to him in that hour, indeed, that Father Joseph was here in a garden in Santa Fe. He would never have left his dear Sandusky when the newly appointed bishop asked him to share his hardships, had he not said to himself, "Ah, now it is he who is torn by perplexity. I will be to him now what he was to me that day when we stood by the roadside waiting for the diligence to Paris, and my purpose broke, and he saved me." That time came back upon Father Vaillant now so keenly that he wiped a little moisture from his eyes. He was quickly moved after the way of sick people, and he cleared his glasses and called, "Father Latour, it's time for you to rest your back. You've been stooping over a great while." The bishop came and sat down in a wheelbarrow that stood at the edge of the arbor. "I've been thinking that I shall no longer pray for your speedy recovery, Joseph. The only way I can keep my vicar within call is to have him sick." Father Joseph smiled. "You are not in Santa Fe a great deal yourself, my bishop." "Well, I shall be here this summer, and I hope to keep you with me. This year I want you to see my lotus flowers. Tranquillino will let the water into my lake this afternoon." The lake was a little pond in the middle of the garden, into which Tranquillino, clever with water, like all Mexicans, had piped a stream from the Santa Fe Creek flowing near at hand. "Last summer, while you were away," the bishop continued, "we had more than 100 lotus blossoms floating on that little lake, and all from 5 bulbs that I put into my valise in Rome." "When do they blossom?" "They begin in June, but they are at their best in July." "Then you must hurry them up a little, for with my bishop's permission I shall be gone in July." "So soon? And why?" Father Vaillant moved uneasily under his blankets. "To hunt for lost Catholics, Jean, utterly lost Catholics, down in your new territory towards Tucson. There are hundreds of poor families down there who have never seen a priest. I want to go from house to house this time, to every little settlement. They are full of devotion and faith, and it has nothing to feed upon but the most mistaken superstitions. They remember their prayers all wrong. They cannot read, and since there is no one to instruct them, how can they get right? They are like seeds, full of germination, but with no moisture. A mere contact is enough to make them a living part of the church. The more I work with the Mexicans, the more I believe it was people like them our Savior bore in mind when he said, 'Unless ye become as little children.' He was thinking of people who are not clever in the things of this world, whose minds are not upon gain and worldly advancement. These poor Christians are not thrifty like our country people at home. They have no veneration for property, no sense of material values. I stop a few hours in a village, I administer the sacraments and hear confessions. I leave in every house some little token, a rosary or a religious picture, and I go away feeling that I have conferred immeasurable happiness and have released faithful souls that were shut away from God by neglect. Down near Tucson, a Pima Indian convert once asked me to go off into the desert with him, as he had something to show me. He took me into a place so wild that a man less accustomed to these things might have mistrusted and feared for his life. We descended into a terrifying canyon of black rock, and there, in the depths of a cave, he showed me a golden chalice, vestments and cruets, all the paraphernalia for celebrating Mass. His ancestors had hidden these sacred objects there when the mission was sacked by Apaches. He did not know how many generations ago. The secret had been handed down in his family, and I was the first priest who had ever come to restore to God his own. To me, that is the situation in a parable. The faith in that wild frontier is like a buried treasure. They guard it, but they do not know how to use it to their soul's salvation. A word, a prayer, a service is all that is needed to set free those souls in bondage. I confess I am covetous of that mission. I desire to be the man who restores these lost children to God. It will be the greatest happiness of my life." The bishop did not reply at once to this appeal. At last he said gravely, "You must realize that I have need of you here, Father Joseph. My duties are too many for one man." "But you do not need me so much as they do." Father Joseph threw off his coverings and sat up in his cassock, putting his feet to the ground. "Any one of our good French priests from Montferrand can serve you here. It is work that can be done by intelligence. But down there, it is work for the heart, for a particular sympathy and none of our new priests understand those poor natures as I do. I have almost become a Mexican. I have learned to like chili colorado and mutton fat. Their foolish ways no longer offend me. Their very faults are dear to me. I am their man. Ah, no doubt, no doubt. But I must insist upon your lying down for the present. Father Vaillant, flushed and excited, dropped back upon his pillows, and the bishop took a short turn through the garden, to the row of tamarisk trees, and back. He walked slowly, with even, unhesitating pace, with that slender, unrigid erectness, and the fine carriage of head which always made him seem master of the situation. No one would have guessed that a sharp struggle was going on within him. Father Joseph's impassioned request had spoiled a cherished plan, and brought Father Latour a bitter personal disappointment. There was but one thing to do, and before he reached the tamarisks he had done it. He broke off a spray of the dry lilac-colored flowers to punctuate and seal, as it were, his renunciation. He returned with the same easy, deliberate tread, and stood smiling beside the army cot. "Your feeling must be your guide in this matter, Joseph. I shall put no obstacles in your way. A certain care for your health I must insist upon, but when you are quite well, you must follow the duty that calls loudest." They were both silent for a few moments. Father Joseph closed his eyes against the sunlight, and Father Latour stood lost in thought, drawing the plume of tamarisk blossom absently through his delicate, rather nervous fingers. His hands had a curious authority, but not the calmness so often seen in the hands of priests. They seemed always to be investigating and making firm decisions. The two friends were roused from their reflections by a frantic beating of wings. A bright flock of pigeons swept over their heads to the far end of the garden, where a woman was just emerging from the gate that led into the school grounds, Magdalena, who came every day to feed the doves and to gather flowers. The sisters had given her charge of the altar decoration of the school chapel for this month, and she came for the bishop's apple blossoms and daffodils. She advanced in a whirlwind of gleaming wings, and Tranquillino dropped his spade and stood watching her. At one moment the whole flock of doves caught the light in such a way that they all became invisible at once, dissolved in light, and disappeared as salt dissolves in water. The next moment they flashed around, black and silver against the sun. They settled upon Magdalena's arms and shoulders, ate from her hand. When she put a crust of bread between her lips, two doves hung in the air before her face, stirring their wings and pecking at the morsel. A handsome woman she had grown to be, with her comely figure and the deep claret color under the golden brown of her cheeks. Who would think, to look at her now, that we took her from a place where every vileness of cruelty and lust was practiced, murmured Father Vaillant. Not since the days of early Christianity has the Church been able to do what it can here. She is but 27 or 8 years old. I wonder whether she ought not to marry again, said the bishop thoughtfully. Though she seems so contented, I have sometimes surprised a tragic shadow in her eyes. Do you remember the terrible look in her eyes when we first saw her? Can I ever forget it? But her very body has changed. She was then a shapeless, cringing creature. I thought her half-witted. No, she has had enough of the storms of this world. Here she is safe and happy. Father Vaillant sat up and called to her, Magdalena, my child, come here and talk to us for a little. 2 men grow lonely when they see nobody but each other. End of The Month of Mary. Book 7, Chapter 2 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. December night. Father Vaillant had been absent in Arizona since midsummer, and it was now December. Bishop Latour had been going through one of those periods of coldness and doubt which, from his boyhood, had occasionally settled down upon his spirit and made him feel an alien wherever he was. He attended to his correspondence, went on his rounds among the parish priests, held services at missions that were without pastors, superintended the building of the addition to the sisters' school. But his heart was not in these things. One night, about 3 weeks before Christmas, he was lying in his bed, unable to sleep, with the sense of failure clutching at his heart. His prayers were empty words and brought him no refreshment. His soul had become a barren field. He had nothing within himself to give his priests or his people. His work seemed superficial, a house built upon the sands. His great diocese was still a heathen country. The Indians traveled their old road of fear and darkness, battling with evil omens and ancient shadows. The Mexicans were children who played with their religion. As the night wore on, the bed on which the bishop lay became a bed of thorns. He could bear it no longer. Getting up in the dark, he looked out of the window and was surprised to find that it was snowing, that the ground was already lightly covered. The full moon, hidden by veils of cloud, threw a pale phosphorescent luminousness over the heavens, and the towers of the church stood up black against this silvery fleece. Father Latour felt a longing to go into the church to pray, but instead he lay down again under his blankets. Then, realizing that it was the cold of the church he shrank from, and despising himself, he rose again, dressed quickly, and went out into the court, throwing on over his cassock that faithful old cloak that was the twin of Father Vaillant's. They had bought the cloth for those coats in Paris long ago, when they were young men staying at the Seminary for Foreign Missions in the Rue de Bac, preparing for their first voyage to the New World. The cloth had been made up into caped riding cloaks by a German tailor in Ohio, and lined with fox fur. Years afterward, when Father Latour was about to start on his long journey in search of his bishopric, that same tailor had made the cloaks over and relined them with squirrel skins, as more appropriate for a mild climate. These memories and many others went through the bishop's mind as he wrapped the trusty garment about him and crossed the court to the sacristy, with the big iron key in his hand. The court was white with snow, and the shadows of walls and buildings stood out sharply in the faint light from the moon, muffled in vapor. In the deep doorway of the sacristy he saw a crouching figure, a woman, he made out, and she was weeping bitterly. He raised her up and took her inside. As soon as he had lit a candle, he recognized her, and could have guessed her errand. It was an old Mexican woman called Sada, who was slave in an American family. They were Protestants, very hostile to the Roman Church, and they did not allow her to go to Mass or to receive the visits of a priest. She was carefully watched at home, but in winter, when the heated rooms of the house were desirable to the family, she was put to sleep in a woodshed. Tonight, unable to sleep for the cold, she had gathered courage for this heroic action, had slipped out through the stable door and come running up an alleyway to the house of God to pray. Finding the front doors of the church fastened, she had made her way into the bishop's garden and come round to the sacristy, only to find that too shut against her. The bishop stood holding the candle and watching her face while she spoke her few words. A dark brown peon face, worn thin and sharp by life and sorrow. It seemed to him that he had never seen pure goodness shine out of a human countenance as it did from hers. He saw that she had no stockings under her shoes, the cast-off raw hides of her master, and beneath her frayed black shawl was only a thin calico dress, covered with patches. Her teeth struck together as she stood trying to control her shivering. With one movement of his free hand, the bishop took the furred cloak from his shoulders and put it about her. This frightened her. She cowered under it, murmuring, "No, no, Padre." "You must obey your Padre, my daughter. Draw that cloak about you, and we will go into the church to pray." The church was utterly black, except for the red spark of the sanctuary lamp before the high altar. Taking her hand and holding the candle before him, he led her across the choir to the Lady Chapel. There he began to light the tapers before the Virgin. Old Sada fell on her knees and kissed the floor. She kissed the feet of the Holy Mother, the pedestal on which they stood, crying all the while. But from the working of her face, from the beautiful tremors which passed over it, he knew they were tears of ecstasy. 19 years, Father, 19 years since I have seen the holy things of the altar." "All that is past, Sada. You have remembered the holy things in your heart. We will pray together." The bishop knelt beside her, and they began, "O Holy Mary, Queen of Virgins." More than once Father Vaillant had spoken to the bishop of this aged captive. There had been much whispering among the devout women of the parish about her pitiful case. The Smiths, with whom she lived, were Georgia people, who had at one time lived in El Paso del Norte, and they had taken her back to their native state with them. Not long ago some disgrace had come upon this family in Georgia. They had been forced to sell all their Negro slaves and flee the state. The Mexican woman they could not sell because they had no legal title to her. Her position was irregular. Now that they were back in a Mexican country, the Smiths were afraid their charwoman might escape from them and find asylum among her own people, so they kept strict watch upon her. They did not allow her to go outside their own patio, not even to accompany her mistress to market. 2 women of the Altar Guild had been so bold as to go into the patio to talk with Sada when she was washing clothes, but they had been rudely driven away by the mistress of the house. Mrs. Smith had come running out into the court, half-dressed, and told them that if they had business at her casa, they were to come in by the front door and not sneak in through the stable to frighten a poor silly creature. When they said they had come to ask Sada to go to Mass with them, she told them she had got the poor creature out of the clutches of the priests once, and would see to it that she did not fall into them again. Even after that rebuff, a very pious neighbor woman had tried to say a word to Sada through the alley door of the stable, where she was unloading wood off the burro, but the old servant had put her finger to her lips and motioned the visitor away, glancing back over her shoulder the while with such an expression of terror that the intruder hastened off, surmising that Sada would be harshly used if she were caught speaking to anyone. The good woman went immediately to Father Vaillant with this story, and he had consulted the bishop, declaring that something ought to be done to secure the consolations of religion for the bondwoman. But the bishop replied that the time was not yet. For the present it was inexpedient to antagonize these people. The Smiths were the leaders of a small group of low-caste Protestants who took every occasion to make trouble for the Catholics. They hung about the door of the church on festival days with mockery and loud laughter, spoke insolently to the nuns in the street, stood jeering and blaspheming when the procession went by on Corpus Christi Sunday. There were 5 sons in the Smith family, fellows of low habits and evil tongues. Even the 2 younger boys, still children, showed a vicious disposition. Tranquillino had repeatedly driven these 2 boys out of the bishop's garden, where they came with their lewd companions to rob the young pear trees or to speak filth against the priests. When they rose from their knees, Father Latour told Sada he was glad to know that she remembered her prayers so well. "Ah, Padre, every night I say my rosary to my Holy Mother, no matter where I sleep. declared the old creature passionately, looking up into his face and pressing her knotted hands against her breast. When he asked if she had her beads with her, she was confused. She kept them tied with a cord around her waist under her clothes, as the only place she could hide them safely. He spoke soothingly to her. "Remember this, Sada. In the year to come, and during the novena before Christmas, I will not forget to pray for you whenever I offer the Blessed Sacrament of the Mass. Be at rest in your heart, for I will remember you in my silent supplications before the altar, as I do my own sisters and my nieces." Never, as he afterward told Father Vaillant, had it been permitted him to behold such deep experience of the holy joy of religion as on that pale December night. He was able to feel, kneeling beside her, the preciousness of the things of the altar to her who was without possessions. The tapers, the image of the Virgin, the figures of the saints, the cross that took away indignity from suffering and made pain and poverty a means of fellowship with Christ. Kneeling beside the much-enduring bondwoman, he experienced those holy mysteries as he had done in his young manhood. He seemed able to feel all it meant to her to know that there was a kind woman in heaven, though there were such cruel ones on earth. Old people who have felt blows and toil and known the world's hard hand need, even more than children do, a woman's tenderness. Only a woman divine could know all that a woman can suffer. Not often, indeed, had Jean-Marie Latour come so near to the fountain of all pity as in the Lady Chapel that night. The pity that no man born of woman could ever utterly cast himself off from, that was for the murderer on the scaffold, as it was for the dying soldier or the martyr on the rack. The beautiful concept of Mary pierced the priest's heart like a sword. "O Sacred Heart of Mary," she murmured by his side, and he felt how that name was food and raiment, friend and mother to her. He received the miracle in her heart into his own, saw through her eyes, knew that his poverty was as bleak as hers. When the kingdom of heaven had first come into the world, into a cruel world of torture and slaves and masters, he who brought it had said, "And whosoever is least among you, the same shall be first in the kingdom of heaven." This church was Sada's house, and he was a servant in it. The bishop heard the old woman's confession. He blessed her and put both hands upon her head. When he took her down the nave to let her out of the church, Sada made to lift his cloak from her shoulders. He restrained her, telling her she must keep it for her own and sleep in it at night. But she slipped out of it hurriedly. Such a thought seemed to terrify her. "No, no, Father, if they were to find it on me." More than that, she did not accuse her oppressors. But as she put it off, she stroked the old garment and patted it as if it were a living thing that had been kind to her. Happily, Father Latour bethought him of a little silver medal with a figure of the Virgin he had in his pocket. He gave it to her, telling her that it had been blessed by the Holy Father himself. Now she would have a treasure to hide and guard, to adore while her watchers slept. Ah, he thought, for one who cannot read or think, the image, the physical form of love. He fitted the great key into its lock. The door swung slowly back on its wooden hinges. The peace without seemed all one with the peace in his own soul. The snow had stopped. The gauzy clouds that had ribbed the arch of heaven were now all sunk into one soft white fog bank over the Sangre de Cristo mountains. The full moon shone high in the blue vault, majestic, lonely, benign. The bishop stood in the doorway of his church, lost in thought, looking at the line of black footprints his departing visitor had left in the wet scurf of snow. End of December Night. Book 7, Chapter 3 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spring in the Navajo country. Father Vaillant was away in Arizona all winter. When the first hint of spring was in the air, the bishop and Jacinto set out on a long ride across New Mexico to the Painted Desert and the Hopi villages. After they left Oraibi, the bishop rode several days to the south to visit a Navajo friend who had lately lost his only son, and who had paid the bishop the compliment of sending word of the boy's death to him at Santa Fe. Father Latour had known Eusebio a long while, had met him soon after he first came to his new diocese. The Navajo was in Santa Fe at that time, assisting the military officers to quiet an outbreak of the never-ending quarrel between his people and the Hopis. Ever since then, the bishop and the Indian chief had entertained an increasing regard for each other. Eusebio brought his son all the way to Santa Fe to have the bishop baptize him, that one beloved son who had died during this last winter. Though he was 10 years younger than Father Latour, Eusebio was one of the most influential men among the Navajo people, and one of the richest in sheep and horses. In Santa Fe and Albuquerque he was respected for his intelligence and authority, and admired for his fine presence. He was extremely tall, even for a Navajo, with a face like a Roman general's of Republican times. He always dressed very elegantly in velvet and buckskin, rich with bead and quill embroidery, belted with silver, and wore a blanket of the finest wool and design. His arms, under the loose sleeves of his shirt, were covered with silver bracelets, and on his breast hung very old necklaces of wampum and turquoise and coral. Mediterranean coral that had been left in the Navajo country by Coronado's captains when they passed through it on their way to discover the Hopi villages and the Grand Canyon. Eusebio lived with his relatives and dependents in a group of hogans on the Colorado Chiquito. To the west and south and north his kinsmen herded his great flocks. Father Latour and Jacinto arrived at the cluster of booth-like cabins during a high sandstorm, which circled about them and their mules like snow in a blizzard, and all but obliterated the landscape. The Navajo came out of his house and took possession of Angelica by her bridle bit. At first he did not open his lips, merely stood holding Father Latour's very fine white hand in his very fine dark one, and looked into his face with a message of sorrow and resignation in his deep-set eagle eyes. A wave of feeling passed over his bronze features as he said, slowly, "My friend has come." That was all, but it was everything. Welcome, confidence, appreciation. For his lodging, the bishop was given a solitary hogan, a little apart from the settlement. Eusebio quickly furnished it with his best skins and blankets, and told his guest that he must tarry a few days there and recover from his fatigue. His mules were tired, the Indian said. The padre himself looked weary, and the way to Santa Fe was long. The bishop thanked him and said he would stay 3 days, that he had need for reflection. His mind had been taken up with practical matters ever since he left home. This seemed a spot where a man might get his thoughts together. The river, a considerable stream at this time of the year, wound among mounds and dunes of loose sand which whirled through the air all day in the boisterous spring winds. The sand banked up against the hogan the bishop occupied, and filtered through chinks in the walls, which were made of saplings plastered with clay. Beside the river was a grove of tall, naked cottonwoods, trees of great antiquity and enormous size, so large that they seemed to belong to a bygone age. They grew far apart, and their strange twisted shapes must have come about from the ceaseless winds that bent them to the east and scoured them with sand, and from the fact that they lived with very little water. The river was nearly dry here for most of the year. The trees rose out of the ground at a slant, and 40 or 50 feet above the earth all these white, dry trunks changed their direction and grew back over their baseline. Some split into great forks which arched down almost to the ground. Some did not fork at all, but the main trunk dipped downward in a strong curve, as if drawn by a bowstring. And some terminated in a thick coruscation of growth, like a crooked palm tree. They were all living trees, yet they seemed to be of old, dead, dry wood, and had very scant foliage. High up in the forks, or at the end of a preposterous length of twisted bough, would burst a faint bouquet of delicate green leaves, out of all keeping with the great lengths of seasoned white trunk and branches. The grove looked like a winter wood of giant trees, with clusters of mistletoe growing along the bare boughs. Navajo hospitality is not intrusive. Eusebio made the bishop understand that he was glad to have him there, and let him alone. Father Latour lived for 3 days in an almost perpetual sandstorm, cut off from even this remote little Indian camp by moving walls and tapestries of sand. He either sat in his house and listened to the wind, or walked abroad under those aged, wind-distorted trees, muffled in an Indian blanket, which he kept drawn up over his mouth and nose. Since his arrival he had undertaken to decide whether he would be justified in recalling Father Vaillant from Tucson. The vicar's occasional letters, brought by travelers, showed that he was highly content where he was, restoring the old mission church of San Javier del Bac, which he declared to be the most beautiful church on the continent, though it had been neglected for more than 200 years. Since Father Vaillant went away, the bishop's burdens had grown heavier and heavier. The new priests from Auvergne were all good men, faithful and untiring in carrying out his wishes. But they were still strangers to the country, timid about making decisions, and referred every difficulty to their bishop. Father Latour needed his vicar, who had so much tact with the natives, so much sympathy with all their shortcomings. When they were together, he was always curbing Father Vaillant's hopeful rashness. But left alone, he greatly missed that very quality, and he missed Father Vaillant's companionship. Why not admit it? Although Jean-Marie Latour and Joseph Vaillant were born in neighboring parishes in the Puy-de-Dôme, as children they had not known each other. The Latours were an old family of scholars and professional men, while the Vaillants were people of a much humbler station in the provincial world. Besides, little Joseph had been away from home much of the time, up on the farm in the Volvic Mountains with his grandfather, where the air was especially pure, and the country quiet salutary for a child of nervous temperament. The two boys had not come together until they were seminarians at Montferrand in Clermont. When Jean-Marie was in his 2nd year at the seminary, he was standing on the recreation ground one day at the opening of the term, looking with curiosity at the new students. In the group he noticed one of peculiarly unpromising appearance, a boy of 19 who was undersized, very pale, homely in feature, with a wart on his chin and tow-colored hair that made him look like a German. This boy seemed to feel his glance, and came up at once, as if he had been called. He was apparently quite unconscious of his homeliness, was not at all shy, but intensely interested in his new surroundings. He asked Jean Latour his name, where he came from, and his father's occupation. Then he said with great simplicity, "My father is a baker, the best in Riom. In fact, he's a remarkable baker." Young Latour was amused, but expressed polite appreciation of this confidence. The queer lad went on to tell him about his brother and his aunt and his clever little sister, Philomena. He asked how long Latour had been at the seminary. "Have you always intended to take orders?" "So have I, but I very nearly went into the army instead." The year previous, after the surrender of Algiers, there had been a military review at Clermont, a great display of uniforms and military bands and stirring speeches about the glory of French arms. Young Joseph Vaillant had lost his head in the excitement and had signed up for a volunteer without consulting his father. He gave Latour a vivid account of his patriotic emotions, of his father's displeasure, and his own subsequent remorse. His mother had wished him to become a priest. She died when he was 13, and ever since then he had meant to carry out her wish and to dedicate his life to the service of the Divine Mother. But that one day, among the bands and the uniforms, he had forgotten everything but his desire to serve France. Suddenly young Vaillant broke off, saying that he must write a letter before the hour was over, and tucking up his gown, he ran away at full speed. Latour stood looking after him, resolved that he would take this new boy under his protection. There was something about the baker's son that had given their meeting the color of an adventure. He meant to repeat it. In that first encounter, he chose the lively, ugly boy for his friend. It was instantaneous. Latour himself was much cooler and more critical in temper, hard to please, and often a little gray in mood. During their seminary years he had easily surpassed his friend in scholarship, but he always realized that Joseph excelled him in the fervor of his faith. After they became missionaries, Joseph had learned to speak English and later Spanish more readily than he. To be sure, he spoke both languages very incorrectly at first, but he had no vanity about grammar or refinement of phrase. To communicate with peons, he was quite willing to speak like a peon. Though the bishop had worked with Father Joseph for 25 years now, he could not reconcile the contradictions of his nature. He simply accepted them, and when Joseph had been away for a long while, realized that he loved them all. His vicar was one of the most truly spiritual men he had ever known, though he was so passionately attached to many of the things of this world. Fond as he was of good eating and drinking, he not only rigidly observed all the fasts of the Church, but he never complained about the hardness and scantiness of the fare on his long missionary journeys. Father Joseph's relish for good wine might have been a fault in another man, but always frail in body, he seemed to need some quick physical stimulant to support his sudden flights of purpose and imagination. Time and again the bishop had seen a good dinner, a bottle of claret, transformed into spiritual energy under his very eyes. From a little feast that would make other men heavy and desirous of repose, Father Vaillant would rise up revived and work for 10 or 12 hours with that ardor and thoroughness which accomplished such lasting results. The bishop had often been embarrassed by his vicar's persistence in begging for the parish, for the cathedral fund and the distant missions. Yet for himself, Father Joseph was scarcely acquisitive to the point of decency. He owned nothing in the world but his mule Contento. Though he received rich vestments from his sister in Riom, his daily apparel was rough and shabby. The bishop had a large and valuable library, at least, and many comforts for his house. There were his beautiful skins and blankets, presents from Eusebio and his other Indian friends. The Mexican women, skilled in needlework and lace-making and hem-stitching, presented him with fine linen for his person, his bed, and his table. He had silver plate, given him by the Olivares and others of his rich parishioners. But Father Vaillant was like the saints of the early Church, literally without personal possessions. In his youth, Joseph had wished to lead a life of seclusion and solitary devotion. But the truth was, he could not be happy for long without human intercourse, and he liked almost everyone. In Ohio, when they used to travel together in stagecoaches, Father Latour had noticed that every time a new passenger pushed his way into the already crowded stage, Joseph would look pleased and interested, as if this were an agreeable addition, whereas he himself felt annoyed, even if he concealed it. The ugly conditions of life in Ohio had never troubled Joseph. The hideous houses and churches, the ill-kept farms and gardens, the slovenly, sordid aspect of the towns and countryside, which continually depressed Father Latour, he seemed scarcely to perceive. One would have said he had no feeling for comeliness or grace. Yet music was a passion with him. In Sandusky it had been his delight to spend evening after evening with his German choirmaster, training the young people to sing Bach oratorios. Nothing one could say of Father Vaillant explained him. The man was much greater than the sum of his qualities. He added a glow to whatever kind of human society he was dropped down into. A Navajo hogan, some abjectly poor little huddle of Mexican huts, or a company of monsignori and cardinals at Rome. It was all the same. The last time the bishop was in Rome, he heard an amusing story from Monsignor Mazzucchi, who had been secretary to Gregory XVI at the time when Father Vaillant went from his Ohio mission for his first visit to the Holy City. Joseph had stayed in Rome for 3 months, living on about 40 cents a day, and leaving nothing unseen. He several times asked Mazzucchi to secure him a private audience with the Pope. The secretary liked the missionary from Ohio. There was something abrupt and lively and naïf about him, a kind of freshness that he did not often find in the priests who flocked to Rome. So he arranged an interview at which only the Holy Father and Father Vaillant and Mazzucchi were present. The missionary came in, attended by a chamberlain who carried 2 great black valises full of objects to be blessed, instead of one, as was customary. After his reception, Father Joseph began to pour out such a vivid account of his missions and brother missionaries that both the Holy Father and the secretary forgot to take account of time, and the audience lasted 3 times as long as such interviews were supposed to last. Gregory XVI, that aristocratic and autocratic prelate, who stood so consistently on the wrong side in European politics, and was the enemy of free Italy, had done more than any of his predecessors to propagate the faith in remote parts of the world. And here was a missionary after his own heart. Father Vaillant asked for blessings for himself, his fellow priests, his missions, his bishop. He opened his big valises like peddlers' packs, full of crosses, rosaries, prayer books, medals, breviaries, on which he begged more than the usual blessing. The astonished chamberlain had come and gone several times, and Mazzucchi at last reminded the Holy Father that he had other engagements. Father Vaillant caught up his 2 valises himself, the chamberlain not being there at the moment, and thus laden was bowing himself backward out of the presence, when the Pope rose from his chair and lifted his hand, not in benediction but in salutation, and called out to the departing missionary, as one man to another, "Coraggio, Americano!" Bishop Latour found his Navajo house favorable for reflection, for recalling the past and planning the future. He wrote long letters to his brother and to old friends in France. The hogan was isolated like a ship's cabin on the ocean, with the murmuring of great winds about it. There was no opening except the door, always open, and the air without had the turbid yellow light of sandstorms. All day long the sand came in through the cracks in the walls and formed little ridges on the earth floor. It rattled like sleet upon the dead leaves of the tree-branch roof. This house was so frail a shelter that one seemed to be sitting in the heart of a world made of dusty earth and moving air. End of Spring in the Navajo Country. Book 7, Chapter 4 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Eusebio. On the third day of his visit with Eusebio, the bishop wrote a somewhat formal letter of recall to his vicar, and then went for his daily walk in the desert. He stayed out until sunset, when the wind fell and the air cleared to a crystal sharpness. As he was returning, still a mile or more up the river, he heard the deep sound of a cottonwood drum, beaten softly. He surmised that the sound came from Eusebio's house, and that his friend was at home. Retracing his steps to the settlement, Father Latour found Eusebio seated beside his doorway, singing in the Navajo language and beating softly on one end of his long drum. Before him, two very little Indian boys, about 4 and 5 years old, were dancing to the music on the hard beaten ground. 2 women, Eusebio's wife and sister, looked on from the deep twilight of the hut. The little boys did not notice the stranger's approach. They were entirely engrossed in their occupation, their faces serious, their chocolate-colored eyes half closed. The bishop stood watching the flowing, supple movements of their arms and shoulders, the sure rhythm of their tiny moccasined feet, no larger than cottonwood leaves. As without a word of instruction, they followed the irregular and strangely accented music. Eusebio himself wore an expression of religious gravity. He sat with the drum between his knees, his broad shoulders bent forward. A crimson banda covered his forehead to hold his black hair. The silver on his dark wrists glittered as he stroked the drumhead with a stick or merely tapped it with his fingers. When he finished the song he was singing, he rose and introduced the little boys, his nephews, by their Indian names, Eagle Feather and Medicine Mountain, after which he nodded to them in dismissal. They vanished into the house. Eusebio handed the drum to his wife and walked away with his guest. "Eusebio," said the bishop, "I want to send a letter to Father Vaillant at Tucson. I will send Jacinto with it, provided you can spare me one of your people to accompany me back to Santa Fe." "I myself will ride with you to the villa," said Eusebio. The Navajos still called the capital by its old name. Accordingly, on the following morning, Jacinto was dispatched southward, and Father Latour and Eusebio, with their pack mule, rode to the east. The ride back to Santa Fe was something under 400 miles. The weather alternated between blinding sandstorms and brilliant sunlight. The sky was as full of motion and change as the desert beneath it was monotonous and still. And there was so much sky, more than at sea, more than anywhere else in the world. The plain was there under one's feet, but what one saw when one looked about was that brilliant blue world of stinging air and moving cloud. Even the mountains were mere ant-hills under it. Elsewhere the sky is the roof of the world, but here the earth was the floor of the sky. The landscape one longed for when one was far away, the thing all about one, the world one actually lived in, was the sky. The sky. Traveling with Eusebio was like traveling with the landscape made human. He accepted chance and weather, as the country did, with a sort of grave enjoyment. He talked little, ate little, slept anywhere, preserved a countenance open and warm, and like Jacinto, he had unfailing good manners. The bishop was rather surprised that he stopped so often by the way to gather flowers. One morning he came back with the mules, holding a bunch of crimson flowers, long tube-shaped bells that hung lightly from one side of a naked stem and trembled in the wind. "The Indians call rainbow flower," he said, holding them up and making the red tubes quiver. "It is early for these." When they left the rock or tree or sand dune that had sheltered them for the night, the Navajo was careful to obliterate every trace of their temporary occupation. He buried the embers of the fire and the remnants of food, unpiled any stones he had piled together, filled up the holes he had scooped in the sand. Since this was exactly Jacinto's procedure, Father Latour judged that, just as it was the white man's way to assert himself in any landscape, to change it, make it over a little, at least to leave some mark or memorial of his sojourn, it was the Indian's way to pass through a country without disturbing anything, to pass and leave no trace, like fish through the water or birds through the air. It was the Indian manner to vanish into the landscape, not to stand out against it. The Hopi villages that were set upon rock mesas were made to look like the rock on which they sat, were imperceptible at a distance. The Navajo hogans among the sand and willows were made of sand and willows. None of the pueblos would at that time admit glass windows into their dwellings. The reflection of the sun on the glazing was to them ugly and unnatural, even dangerous. Moreover, these Indians disliked novelty and change. They came and went by the old paths worn into the rock by the feet of their fathers, used the old natural stairway of stone to climb to their mesa towns, carried water from the old springs, even after white men had dug wells. In the working of silver or drilling of turquoise, the Indians had exhaustless patience. Upon their blankets and belts and ceremonial robes, they lavished their skill and pains. But their conception of decoration did not extend to the landscape. They seemed to have none of the European's desire to master nature, to arrange and recreate. They spent their ingenuity in the other direction, in accommodating themselves to the scene in which they found themselves. This was not so much from indolence, the bishop thought, as from an inherited caution and respect. It was as if the great country were asleep and they wished to carry on their lives without awakening it, or as if the spirits of earth and air and water were things not to antagonize and arouse. When they hunted, it was with the same discretion. An Indian hunt was never a slaughter. They ravaged neither the rivers nor the forest, and if they irrigated, they took as little water as would serve their needs. The land and all that it bore they treated with consideration, not attempting to improve it. They never desecrated it. As Father Latour and Eusebio approached Albuquerque, they occasionally fell in with company, Indians going to and fro on the long winding trails across the plain, or up into the Sandia Mountains. They had all of them the same quiet way of moving, whether their pace was swift or slow, and the same unobtrusive demeanor. An Indian wrapped in his bright blanket, seated upon his mule or walking beside it, moving through the pale, new-budding sagebrush, winding among the sand waves, as if it were his business to pass unseen and unheard through a country awakening with spring. North of Laguna, 2 Zuni runners sped by them, going somewhere east on Indian business. They saluted Eusebio by gestures with the open palm, but did not stop. They coursed over the sand with the fleetness of young antelope, their bodies disappearing and reappearing among the sand dunes, like the shadows that eagles cast in their strong, unhurried flight. End of Eusebio. Book 8, Chapter 1 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 8, Gold Under Pike's Peak, Chapter 1, Cathedral. Father Vaillant had been in Santa Fe nearly 3 weeks, and as yet nothing had been revealed to him that warranted his bishop in calling him back from Tucson. One morning Fructosa came into the garden to tell him that lunch would be earlier than usual, as the bishop was going to ride somewhere that afternoon. Half an hour later he joined his superior in the dining room. The bishop seldom lunched alone. That was the hour when he could most conveniently entertain a priest from one of the distant parishes, an army officer, an American trader, a visitor from Old Mexico or California. He had no parlor. His dining room served that purpose. It was long and cool, with windows only at the west end, opening into the garden. The green jalousies let in a tempered light. Sunbeams played on the white, rounded walls and twinkled on the glass and silver of the sideboard. When Madame Olivares left Santa Fe to return to New Orleans and sold her effects at auction, Father Latour bought her sideboard and the dining table, around which friends had so often gathered. Doña Isabella gave him her silver coffee service and candelabra for remembrance. They were the only ornaments of the severe and shadowy room. The bishop was already at his place when Father Joseph entered. "Fructuosa has told you why we are lunching early? We will take a ride this afternoon. I have something to show you." "Very good. Perhaps you have noticed that I am a little restless. I don't know when I have been 2 weeks out of the saddle before. When I go to visit Contento in his stall, he looks at me reprovingly. He will grow too fat." The bishop smiled, with a shade of sarcasm on his upper lip. He knew his Joseph. "Ah, well," he said carelessly, "a little rest will not hurt him, after coming 600 miles from Tucson. You can take him out this afternoon, and I will ride Angelica." The two priests left Santa Fe a little after midday, riding west. The bishop did not disclose his objective, and the vicar asked no questions. Soon they left the wagon road and took a trail running straight south, through an empty greasewood country, sloping gradually in the direction of the naked blue Sandia Mountains. At about 4 o'clock they came out upon a ridge high over the Rio Grande Valley. The trail dropped down a long decline at this point and wound about the foot of the Sandias into Albuquerque, some 60 miles away. This ridge was covered with cone-shaped rocky hills, thinly clad with piñons, and the rock was a curious shade of green, something between sea green and olive. The thin, pebbly earth, which was merely the rock pulverized by weather, had the same green tint. Father Latour rode to an isolated hill that beetled over the western edge of the ridge, just where the trail descended. This hill stood up high and quite alone, boldly facing the declining sun and the blue Sandias. As they drew close to it, Father Vaillant noticed that on the western face the earth had been scooped away, exposing a rugged wall of rock, not green like the surrounding hills, but yellow, a strong golden ochre, very much like the gold of the sunlight that was now beating upon it. Picks and crowbars lay about, and fragments of stone freshly broken off. "It is curious, is it not, to find one yellow hill among all these green ones?" remarked the bishop, stooping to pick up a piece of the stone. "I have ridden over these hills in every direction, but this is the only one of its kind." He stood regarding the chip of yellow rock that lay in his palm. As he had a very special way of handling objects that were sacred, he extended that manner to things which he considered beautiful. After a moment of silence, he looked up at the rugged wall, gleaming gold above them. "That hill, Blanchet, is my cathedral." Father Joseph looked at his bishop, then at the cliff, blinking. "Vraiment? Is the stone hard enough? A good color, certainly. Something like the colonnade of St. Peter's." The bishop smoothed the piece of rock with his thumb. "It is more like something nearer home. I mean nearer Clermont. When I look up at this rock, I can almost feel the Rhone behind me." "Ah, you mean the old palace of the popes at Avignon. Yes, you are right. It is very like. At this hour it is like this." The bishop sat down on a boulder, still looking up at the cliff. "It is the stone I have always wanted, and I found it quite by chance. I was coming back from Isleta. I had been to see old Padre Jesus when he was dying. I had never come by this trail, but when I reached Santo Domingo, I found the road so washed by a heavy rain that I turned out and decided to try this way home. I rode up here from the west in the late afternoon. This hill confronted me as it confronts us now, and I knew instantly that it was my cathedral. Oh, such things are never accidents, Jean. But it will be a long while before you can think of building. Not so very long, I hope. I should like to complete it before I die, if God so wills. I wish to leave nothing to chance or to the mercy of American builders. I had rather keep the old adobe church we have now than help to build one of those horrible structures they are putting up in the Ohio cities. I want a plain church, but I want a good one. I shall certainly never lift my hand to build a clumsy affair of red brick, like an English coach-house. Our own midi Romanesque is the right style for this country. Father Vaillant sniffed and wiped his glasses. If you once begin thinking about architects and styles, Jean, and if you don't get American builders, whom will you get, pray? I have an old friend in Toulouse who is a very fine architect. I talked this matter over with him when I was last at home. He cannot come himself. He is afraid of the long sea voyage, and not used to horseback travel. But he has a young son still at his studies who is eager to undertake the work. Indeed, his father writes me that it has become the young man's dearest ambition to build the first Romanesque church in the New World. He will have studied the right models. He thinks our old churches of the Midi the most beautiful in France. When we are ready, he will come and bring with him a couple of good French stone-cutters. They will certainly be no more expensive than workmen from St. Louis. Now that I have found exactly the stone I want, my cathedral seems to me already begun. This hill is only about 15 miles from Santa Fe. There is an upgrade, but it is gradual. Hauling the stone will be easier than I could have hoped for. You plan far ahead. Father Vaillant looked at his friend wonderingly. Well, that is what a bishop should be able to do. As for me, I see only what is under my nose. But I had no idea you were going in for fine building when everything about us is so poor, and we ourselves are so poor. But the cathedral is not for us, Father Joseph. We build for the future. Better not lay a stone unless we can do that. It would be a shame to any man coming from a seminary that is one of the architectural treasures of France to make another ugly church on this continent where there are so many already. You are probably right. I had never thought of it before. It never occurred to me that we could have anything but an Ohio church here. Your ancestors helped to build Claremont Cathedral, I remember. 2 building Bishops de la Tour back in the 13th century. Time brings things to pass, certainly. I had no idea you were taking all this so much to heart. Father Latour laughed. Is a cathedral a thing to be taken lightly, after all? Oh, no, certainly not. Father Vaillant moved his shoulders uneasily. He did not himself know why he hung back in this. The base of the hill before which they stood was already in shadow, subdued to the tone of rich yellow clay, but the top was still melted gold, a color that throbbed in the last rays of the sun. The bishop turned away at last with a sigh of deep content. Yes, he said slowly, that rock will do very well. And now we must be starting home. Every time I come here, I like this stone better. I could hardly have hoped that God would gratify my personal taste. my vanity, if you will, in this way. I tell you, Planchet, I would rather have found that hill of yellow rock than have come into a fortune to spend in charity. The cathedral is near my heart for many reasons. I hope you do not think me very worldly." As they rode home through the sagebrush, silvered by moonlight, Father Vaillant was still wondering why he had been called home from saving souls in Arizona, and wondering why a poor missionary bishop should care so much about a building. He himself was eager to have the cathedral begun, but whether it was Midi-Romanesque or Ohio German in style seemed to him of little consequence. End of Cathedral. Book 8, Chapter 2 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A letter from Leavenworth. The day after the bishop and his vicar rode to the Yellow Rock, the weekly post arrived at Santa Fe. It brought the bishop many letters, and he was shut in his study all morning. At lunch, he told Father Vaillant that he would require his company that evening to consider with him a letter of great importance from the Bishop of Leavenworth. This letter, of many pages, was concerned with events that were happening in Colorado, in a part of the Rocky Mountains very little known. Though it was only a few hundred miles north of Santa Fe, communication with that region was so infrequent that news traveled to Santa Fe from Europe more quickly than from Pike's Peak. Under the shadow of that peak, rich gold deposits had been discovered within the last year, but Father Vaillant had first heard of this through a letter from France. Word of it had reached the Atlantic coast, crossed to Europe, and come from there back to the southwest more quickly than it could filter down through the few hundred miles of unexplored mountains and gorges between Cripple Creek and Santa Fe. While Father Vaillant was at Tucson, he had received a letter from his brother Marius in Auvergne, and was vexed that so much of it was taken up with inquiries about the gold rush to Colorado, of which he had never heard, while Marius gave him but little news of the war in Italy, which seemed relatively near and much more important. That congested heaping up of the Rocky Mountain chain about Pike's Peak was a blank space on the continent at this time. Even the fur trappers coming down from Wyoming to Taos with their pelts avoided that humped granite backbone. Only a few years before, Fremont had tried to penetrate the Colorado Rockies, and his party had come half-starved into Taos at last, having eaten most of their horses. But within 12 months everything had changed. Wandering prospectors had found large deposits of gold near Cripple Creek, and the mountains that were solitary a year ago were now full of people. Wagon trains were streaming westward across the prairies from the Missouri River. The Bishop of Leavenworth wrote Father Latour that he himself had just returned from a visit to Cripple Creek. He had found the slopes under Pike's Peak dotted with camps, the gorges black with placer miners. Thousands of people were living in tents and shacks. Cherry Creek was full of saloons and gambling rooms. And among all the wanderers and wastrels were many honest men, hundreds of good Catholics, and not one priest. The young men were adrift in a lawless society without spiritual guidance. The old men died from exposure and mountain pneumonia, with no one to give them the last rites of the Church. This new and populous community must, for the present, the Kansas bishop wrote, be accounted under Father Latour's jurisdiction. His great diocese, already enlarged by thousands of square miles to the south and west, must now, on the north, take in the still undefined but suddenly important region of the Colorado Rockies. The Bishop of Leavenworth begged him to send a priest there as soon as possible, an able one by all means, not only devoted but resourceful and intelligent, one who would be at his ease with all sorts of men. He must take his bedding and camp outfit, medicines and provisions, and clothing for the severe winter. At Camp Denver there was nothing to be bought but tobacco and whiskey. There were no women there, and no cook stoves. The miners lived on half-baked dough and alcohol. They did not even keep the mountain water pure, and so died of fever. All the living conditions were abominable. In the evening, after dinner, Father Latour read this letter aloud to Father Vaillant in his study. When he had finished, he put down the closely written pages. "You have been complaining of inactivity, Father Joseph. Here is your opportunity." Father Joseph, who had been growing more and more restless during the reading of the letter, said merely, "So, now I must begin speaking English again. I can start tomorrow, if you wish it." The bishop shook his head. "Not so fast. There will be no hospitable Mexicans to receive you at the end of this journey. You must take your living with you. We will have a wagon built for you. And choose your outfit carefully. Tranquillino's brother, Sabino, will be your driver. This, I fear, will be the hardest mission you have ever undertaken." The two priests talked until a late hour. There was Arizona to be considered. Somebody must be found to continue Father Vaillant's work there. Of all the countries he knew, that desert and its yellow people were the dearest to him. But it was the discipline of his life to break ties, to say farewell and move on into the unknown. Before he went to bed that night, Father Joseph greased his boots and trimmed the calloused spots on his feet with an old razor. At the Mexican village of Chimayo, over toward the Truchas Mountains, the good people were especially devoted to a little equestrian image of Santiago in their church, and they made him a new pair of boots every few months, insisting that he went abroad at night and wore out his shoes, even on horseback. When Father Joseph stayed there, he used to tell them he wished that, in addition to the consecration of the hands, God had provided some special blessing for the missionaries' feet. He recalled affectionately an incident which concerned this Santiago of Chimayo. Some years ago, Father Joseph was asked to go to the Calabozo at Santa Fe to see a murderer from Chimayo. The prisoner proved to be a boy of 20. Very gentle in face and manner. His name was Ramon Armajillo. He had been passionately fond of cockfighting, and it was his undoing. He had bred a rooster that never lost a battle, but had slit the necks of cocks in all the little towns about. At last, Ramon brought the bird to Santa Fe to match him with a famous cock there, and half a dozen Chimayo boys came along and put up everything they had on Ramon's rooster. The betting was heavy on both sides, and the gate receipts also were to go to the winner. After a somewhat doubtful beginning, Ramon's cock neatly ripped the jugular vein of his opponent, but the owner of the defeated bird, before anyone could stop him, reached into the ring and wrung the victor's neck. Before he had dropped the limp bunch of feathers from his hand, Ramon's knife was in his heart. It all happened in a flash. Some of the witnesses even insisted that the death of the man and the death of the cock were simultaneous. All agreed that there was not time for a man to catch his breath between the whirl of the wrist and the gleam of the knife. Unfortunately, the American judge was a very stupid man who disliked Mexicans and hoped to wipe out cockfighting. He accepted as evidence statements made by the murdered man's friends to the effect that Ramon had repeatedly threatened his life. When Father Vaillant went to see the boy in his cell a few days before his execution, he found him making a pair of tiny buckskin boots, as if for a doll, and Ramon told him that they were for the little Santiago in the church at home. his family would come up to Santa Fe for the hanging, and they would take the boots back to Chimayo, and perhaps the little saint would say a good word for him. Rubbing oil into his boots by candlelight, Father Vaillant sighed. The criminals with whom he would have to do in Colorado would hardly be of that type, he told himself. End of A Letter from Leavenworth. Book 8, Chapter 3 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auspice Maria. The construction of Father Vaillant's wagon took a month. It must be a wagon of very unusual design, capable of carrying a great deal, yet light enough and narrow enough to wind through the mountain gorges beyond Pueblo, where there were no roads at all, except the rocky ravines cut out by streams that flowed full in the spring, but would be dry now in the autumn. While his wagon was building, Father Joseph was carefully selecting his stores and the furnishings for a small chapel which he meant to construct of saplings or canvas immediately upon his arrival at Camp Denver. Moreover, there were his valises full of medals, crosses, rosaries, colored pictures, and religious pamphlets. For himself, he required no books but his breviary and the ordinary of the Mass. In the bishop's courtyard he sorted and resorted his cargo, always finding a more necessary article, for which a less necessary had to be discarded. Fructosa and Magdalena were frequently called upon to help him, and when a box was finally closed, Fructosa had it put away in the woodshed. She had noticed the bishop's brows contract slightly when he came upon these trunks and chests in his hallway and dining room. All the bedding and clothing was packed in great sacks of dressed calfskin, which Sabino procured from old Mexican settlers. These were already going out of fashion, but in the early days they were the poor man's trunk. Bishop Latour also was very busy at this time, training a new priest from Claremont, riding about with him among the distant parishes, and trying to give him an understanding of the people. As a bishop, he could only approve Father Vaillant's eagerness to be gone, and the enthusiasm with which he turned to hardships of a new kind. But as a man, he was a little hurt that his old comrade should leave him without one regret. He seemed to know, as if it had been revealed to him, that this was a final break, that their lives would part here, and that they would never work together again. The bustle of preparation in his own house was painful to him, and he was glad to be abroad among the parishes. One day, when the bishop had just returned from Albuquerque, Father Vaillant came in to luncheon in high spirits. He had been out for a drive in his new wagon, and declared that it was satisfactory at last. Sabino was ready, and he thought they would start the day after tomorrow. He diagrammed his route on the tablecloth, and went over the catalogue of his equipment. The bishop was tired, and scarcely touched his food, but Father Joseph ate generously, as he was apt to do when fired by a new project. After Fructosa had brought the coffee, he leaned back in his chair and turned to his friend with a beaming face. "I often think, Jean, how you were an unconscious agent in the hands of Providence when you recalled me from Tucson. I seemed to be doing the most important work of my life there, and you recalled me for no reason at all, apparently. You did not know why, and I did not know why. We were both acting in the dark, but heaven knew what was happening at Cripple Creek, and moved us like chessmen on the board. When the call came, I was here to answer it. By a miracle, indeed." Father Latour put down his silver coffee cup. "Miracles are all very well, Joseph, but I see none here. I sent for you because I felt the need of your companionship. I used my authority as a bishop to gratify my personal wish. That was selfish, if you will, but surely natural enough. We are countrymen, and are bound by early memories. and that two friends, having come together, should part and go their separate ways, that is natural too. No, I don't think we need any miracle to explain all this." Father Vaillant had been wholly absorbed in his preparations for saving souls in the gold camps, blind to everything else. Now it came over him in a flash how the bishop had held himself aloof from his activities. It was a very hard thing for Father Latour to let him go. The loneliness of his position had begun to weigh upon him. Yes, he reflected as he went quietly to his own room, there was a great difference in their natures. Wherever he went, he soon made friends that took the place of country and family. But Jean, who was at ease in any society, and always the flower of courtesy, could not form new ties. It had always been so. He was like that even as a boy, gracious to everyone, but known to a very few. To man's wisdom it would have seemed that a priest, with Father Latour's exceptional qualities, would have been better placed in some part of the world where scholarship, a handsome person, and delicate perceptions all have their effect, and that a man of a much rougher type would have served God well enough as the first bishop of New Mexico. Doubtless, Bishop Latour's successors would be men of a different fibre, but God had his reasons, Father Joseph devoutly believed. Perhaps it pleased him to grace the beginning of a new era and a vast new diocese by a fine personality, and perhaps, after all, something would remain through the years to come, some ideal or memory or legend. The next afternoon, his wagon loaded and standing ready in the courtyard, Father Vaillant was seated at the bishop's desk, writing letters to France, a short one to Marius, a long one to his beloved Philomena, telling her of his plunge into the unknown and begging her prayers for his success in the world of gold-crazed men. He wrote rapidly and jerkily, moving his lips as well as his fingers. When the bishop entered the study, he rose and stood holding the written pages in his hand. "I did not mean to interrupt you, Joseph, but do you intend to take Contento with you to Colorado?" Father Joseph blinked. "Why, certainly I had intended to ride him. However, if you have need for him here—" "Oh, no, not at all. But if you take Contento, I will ask you to take Angelica as well. They have a great affection for each other. Why separate them indefinitely? One could not explain to them. They have worked long together." Father Vaillant made no reply. He stood looking intently at the pages of his letter. The bishop saw a drop of water splash down upon the violet script and spread. He turned quickly and went out through the arched doorway. At sunrise next morning, Father Vaillant set out, Sabino driving the wagon, his oldest boy riding Angelica, and Father Joseph himself riding Contento. They took the old road to the northeast, through the sharp red sandhills spotted with juniper, and the bishop accompanied them as far as the loop where the road wound out on the top of one of those conical hills, giving the departing traveler his last glimpse of Santa Fe. There Father Joseph drew rein and looked back at the town lying rosy in the morning light, the mountain behind it, and the hills close about it like two encircling arms. "Auspice Maria," he murmured as he turned his back on these familiar things. The bishop rode home to his solitude. He was 47 years old, and he had been a missionary in the New World for 20 years, 10 of them in New Mexico. If he were a parish priest at home, there would be nephews coming to him for help in their Latin or a bit of pocket money, nieces to run into his garden and bring their sewing and keep an eye on his housekeeping. All the way home he indulged in such reflections as any bachelor nearing 50 might have. But when he entered his study, he seemed to come back to reality, to the sense of a presence awaiting him. The curtain of the arched doorway had scarcely fallen behind him when that feeling of personal loneliness was gone, and a sense of loss was replaced by a sense of restoration. He sat down before his desk, deep in reflection. It was just this solitariness of love in which a priest's life could be like his master's. It was not a solitude of atrophy, of negation, but of perpetual flowering. A life need not be cold or devoid of grace in the worldly sense, if it were filled by her who was all the graces, virgin daughter, virgin mother, girl of the people, and queen of heaven. La rêve suprême de la chair. The nursery tale could not vie with her in simplicity. The wisest theologians could not match her in profundity. Here in his own church in Santa Fe there was one of these nursery virgins, a little wooden figure, very old and very dear to the people. De Vargas, when he recaptured the city for Spain 200 years ago, had vowed a yearly procession in her honor, and it was still one of the most solemn events of the Christian year in Santa Fe. She was a little wooden figure about 3 feet high, very stately in bearing, with a beautiful though rather severe Spanish face. She had a rich wardrobe, a chest full of robes and laces and gold and silver diadems. The women loved to sew for her, and the silversmiths to make her chains and brooches. Father Latour had delighted her wardrobe keepers when he told them he did not believe the Queen of England or the Empress of France had so many costumes. She was their doll and their queen, something to fondle and something to adore, as Mary's son must have been to her. These poor Mexicans, he reflected, were not the first to pour out their love in this simple fashion. Raphael and Titian had made costumes for her in their time, and the great masters had made music for her, and the great architects had built cathedrals for her. Long before her years on earth, in that long twilight between the fall and the redemption, the pagan sculptors were always trying to achieve the image of a goddess who should yet be a woman. Bishop Latour's premonition was right. Father Vaillant never returned to share his work in New Mexico. Come back he did to visit his old friends whenever his busy life permitted, but his destiny was fulfilled in the cold, steely Colorado Rockies, which he never loved as he did the blue mountains of the South. He came back to Santa Fe to recuperate from the illnesses and accidents which consistently punctuated his way, came with the papal emissary when Bishop Latour was made Archbishop, but his working life was spent among bleak mountains and comfortless mining camps, looking after lost sheep. Creede, Durango, Silver City, Central City, over the Continental Divide into Utah. His strange episcopal carriage was known throughout that rugged granite world. It was a covered carriage on springs, and long enough for him to lie down in at night. Father Joseph was a very short man. At the back was a luggage box, which could be made into an altar when he celebrated Mass in the open under a pine tree. He used to say that the mountain torrents were the first road builders, and that wherever they found a way, he could find one. He wore out driver after driver, and his coach was repaired so often and so extensively that long before he abandoned it, there was none of the original structure left. Broken tongues and singletrees, smashed wheels, and splintered axles he considered trifling matters. Twice the old carriage itself slipped off the mountain road and rolled down the gorge, with the priest inside. From the first accident of this kind, Father Vaillant escaped with nothing worse than a sprain, and he wrote Bishop Latour that he attributed his preservation to the Archangel Raphael, whose office he had said with unusual fervor that morning. The second time he rolled down a ravine near Central City, his thigh bone was broken just below the joint. It knitted in time, but he was lamed for life and could never ride horseback again. Before this accident befell him, however, he had one long visit among his friends in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, a renewal of old ties that was like an Indian summer in his life. When he left Denver, he told his congregation that he was going to the Mexicans to beg for money. The church in Denver was under a roof, but the windows had been boarded up for months because nobody would buy glass for them. In his Denver congregation there were men who owned mines and sawmills and flourishing businesses, but they needed all their money to push these enterprises. Down among the Mexicans, who owned nothing but a mud house and a burro, he could always raise money. If they had anything at all, they gave. He called this trip, frankly, a begging expedition, and he went in his carriage to bring back whatever he could gather. When he got as far as Taos, his Irish driver mutinied. "Not another mile over these roads," he said. He knew his own territory, but here he refused to risk his neck and the Padres'. There was then no wagon road from Taos to Santa Fe. It was nearly a fortnight before Father Vaillant found a man who would undertake to get him through the mountains. At last an old driver, schooled on the wagon trains, volunteered, and with the help of axe and pick and shovel, he brought the episcopal carriage safely to Santa Fe and into the bishop's courtyard. Once again among his own people, as he still called them, Father Joseph opened his campaign, and the poor Mexicans began taking dollars out of their shirts and boots, favorite places for carrying money, to pay for windows in the Denver church. His petitions did not stop with windows. Indeed, they only began there. He told the sympathetic women of Santa Fe and Albuquerque about all the stupid, unnecessary discomforts of his life in Denver, discomforts that amounted to improprieties. It was a part of the Wild West attitude to despise the decencies of life. He told them how glad he was to sleep in good Mexican beds once more. In Denver he lay on a mattress stuffed with straw. A French priest who was visiting him had pulled out a long stem of hay that stuck through the thin ticking and called it an American feather. His dining table was made of planks covered with oilcloth. He had no linen at all, neither sheets nor serviettes, and he used his worn-out shirts for face towels. The Mexican women could scarcely bear to hear of such things. Nobody in Colorado planted gardens, Father Vaillant related. Nobody would stick a shovel into the earth for anything less than gold. There was no butter, no milk, no eggs, no fruit. He lived on dough and cured hog meat. Within a few weeks after his arrival, 6 feather beds were sent to the bishop's house for Father Vaillant, dozens of linen sheets, embroidered pillowcases and tablecloths and napkins, strings of chili, and boxes of beans and dried fruit. The little settlement of Chimayo sent a roll of their finest blankets. As these gifts arrived, Father Joseph put them in the woodhouse, knowing well that the bishop was always embarrassed by his readiness to receive presents. But one morning Father Latour had occasion to go into the woodhouse, and he saw for himself. "Father Joseph," he remonstrated, "you will never be able to take all these things back to Denver. Why, you would need an ox cart to carry them." "Very well," replied Father Joseph, "then God will send me an ox cart." And he did, with a driver, to take the cart as far as Pueblo. On the morning of his departure for home, when his carriage was ready, the cart covered with tarpaulins, and the oxen yoked, Father Vaillant, who had been hurrying everyone since the first streak of light, suddenly became deliberate. He went into the bishop's study and sat down, talking to him of unimportant matters, lingering as if there were something still undone. "Well, we are getting older, Jean," he said abruptly, after a short silence. The bishop smiled. "Ah, yes, we are not young men any more. One of these departures will be the last." Father Vaillant nodded. "Whenever God wills, I am ready." He rose and began to pace the floor, addressing his friend without looking at him. "But it has not been so bad, Jean. We have done the things we used to plan to do long ago, when we were seminarians, at least some of them. To fulfill the dreams of one's youth, that is the best that can happen to a man. No worldly success can take the place of that." "Blanchet," said the bishop, rising, "you are a better man than I. You have been a great harvester of souls, without pride and without shame, and I am always a little cold, en pedant, as you used to say. If hereafter we have stars in our crowns, yours will be a constellation. Give me your blessing." He knelt, and Father Vaillant, having blessed him, knelt and was blessed in turn. They embraced each other for the past, for the future. End of Auspice Maria. Book 9, Chapter 1 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 9, Death Comes for the Archbishop, Chapter 1. When that devout nun, Mother Superior Philomena, died at a great age in her native realm, among her papers were found several letters from Archbishop Latour. One dated December 1888, only a few months before his death. "Since your brother was called to his reward," he wrote, "I feel nearer to him than before. For many years duty separated us, but death has brought us together. The time is not far distant when I shall join him. Meanwhile, I am enjoying to the full that period of reflection which is the happiest conclusion to a life of action." This period of reflection the Archbishop spent on his little country estate, some 4 miles north of Santa Fe. Long before his retirement from the cares of the diocese, Father Latour bought those few acres in the red sandhills near the Tesuque Pueblo, and set out an orchard which would be bearing when the time came for him to rest. He chose this place in the red hills, spotted with juniper, against the advice of his friends, because he believed it to be admirably suited for the growing of fruit. Once, when he was riding out to visit the Tesuque mission, he had followed a stream and come upon this spot, where he found a little Mexican house and a garden shaded by an apricot tree of such great size as he had never seen before. It had 2 trunks, each of them thicker than a man's body, and, though evidently very old, it was full of fruit. The apricots were large, beautifully colored, and of superb flavor. Since this tree grew against the hillside, the Archbishop concluded that the exposure there must be excellent for fruit. He surmised that the heat of the sun, reflected from the rocky hill slope up into the tree, gave the fruit an even temperature, warmth from 2 sides, such as brings the wall peaches to perfection in France. The old Mexican who lived there said the tree must be 200 years old. It had been just like this when his grandfather was a boy, and had always borne luscious apricots like these. The old man would be glad to sell the place and move into Santa Fe, the bishop found, and he bought it a few weeks later. In the spring he set out his orchard and a few rows of acacia trees. Some years afterward he built a little adobe house with a chapel high up on the hillside overlooking the orchard. Thither he used to go for rest and at seasons of special devotion. After his retirement he went there to live, though he always kept his study unchanged in the house of the new Archbishop. In his retirement, Father Latour's principal work was the training of the new missionary priests who arrived from France. His successor, the second Archbishop, was also an Auvergnat from Father Latour's own college, and the clergy of northern New Mexico remained predominantly French. When a company of new priests arrived, they never came singly. Archbishop S. sent them out to stay with Father Latour for a few months to receive instruction in Spanish, in the topography of the diocese, in the character and traditions of the different pueblos. Father Latour's recreation was his garden. He grew such fruit as was hardly to be found even in the old orchards of California. Cherries and apricots, apples and quinces, and the peerless pears of France, even the most delicate varieties. He urged the new priests to plant fruit trees wherever they went, and to encourage the Mexicans to add fruit to their starchy diet. Wherever there was a French priest, there should be a garden of fruit trees and vegetables and flowers. He often quoted to his students that passage from their fellow Auvergnat, Pascal, that man was lost and saved in a garden. He domesticated and developed the native wildflowers. He had one hillside solidly clad with that low-growing purple verbena, which mats over the hills of New Mexico. It was like a great violet velvet mantle thrown down in the sun, all the shades that the dyers and weavers of Italy and France strove for through centuries, the violet that is full of rose color and is yet not lavender, the blue that becomes almost pink and then retreats again into sea-dark purple, the true episcopal color, and countless variations of it. In the year 1885, there came to New Mexico a young seminarian, Bernard Ducrot, who became like a son to Father Latour. The story of the old Archbishop's life, often told in the cloisters and classrooms at Montferrand, had taken hold of this boy's imagination, and he had long waited an opportunity to come. Bernard was handsome in person and of unusual mentality, had in himself the fineness to reverence all that was fine in his venerable superior. He anticipated Father Latour's every wish, shared his reflections, cherished his reminiscences. Surely, the bishop used to say to the priests, God himself has sent me this young man to help me through the last years. End of Book 9, Chapter 1. Book 9, Chapter 2 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 9, Chapter 2. Throughout the autumn of the year 88, the bishop was in good health. He had 5 French priests in his house, and he still rode abroad with them to visit the nearer missions. On Christmas Eve, he performed the midnight mass in the cathedral at Santa Fe. In January, he drove with Bernard to Santa Cruz to see the resident priest, who was ill. While they were on their way home, the weather suddenly changed, and a violent rainstorm overtook them. They were in an open buggy and were drenched to the skin before they could reach any Mexican house for shelter. After arriving home, Father Latour went at once to bed. During the night he slept badly and felt feverish. He called none of his household, but arose at the usual hour before dawn and went into the chapel for his devotions. While he was at prayer, he was seized with a chill. He made his way to the kitchen, and his old cook, Fructosa, alarmed at once, put him to bed and gave him brandy. This chill left him feverish, and he developed a distressing cough. After keeping quietly to his bed for a few days, The bishop called young Bernard to him one morning and said, "Bernard, will you ride into Santa Fe today and see the Archbishop for me? Ask him whether it will be quite convenient if I return to occupy my study in his house for a short time. Je voudrais mourir à Santa Fe." "I will go at once, Father, but you should not be discouraged. One does not die of a cold." The old man smiled. "I shall not die of a cold, my son. I shall die of having lived." From that moment on he spoke only French to those about him, and this sudden relaxing of his rule alarmed his household more than anything else about his condition. When a priest had received bad news from home, or was ill, Father Latour would converse with him in his own language, but at other times he required that all conversation in his house should be in Spanish or English. Bernard returned that afternoon to say that the Archbishop would be delighted if Father Latour would remain the rest of the winter with him. Magdalena had already begun to air his study and put it in order, and she would be in special attendance upon him during his visit. The Archbishop would send his new carriage to fetch him, as Father Latour had only an open buggy. "Not today, mon fils," said the bishop. "We will choose a day when I am feeling stronger, a fair day when we can go in my own buggy, and you can drive me. I wish to go late in the afternoon, toward sunset." Bernard understood. He knew that once, long ago, at that hour of the day, a young bishop had ridden along the Albuquerque road and seen Santa Fe for the first time. And often, when they were driving into town together, the bishop had paused with Bernard on that hilltop from which Father Vaillant had looked back on Santa Fe, when he went away to Colorado to begin the work that had taken the rest of his life and made him, too, a bishop in the end. The old town was better to look at in those days, Father Latour used to tell Bernard with a sigh. In the old days it had an individuality, a style of its own, a tawny adobe town with a few green trees, set in a half-circle of carnelian-colored hills. That, and no more. But the year 1880 had begun a period of incongruous American building. Now half the Plaza Square was still adobe, and half was flimsy wooden buildings with double porches, scroll-work, and jack-straw posts and banisters painted white. Father Latour said the wooden houses which had so distressed him in Ohio had followed him. All this was quite wrong for the cathedral he had been so many years in building, the cathedral that had taken Father Vaillant's place in his life after that remarkable man went away. Father Latour made his last entry into Santa Fe at the end of a brilliant February afternoon. Bernard stopped the horses at the foot of the long street to await the sunset. Wrapped in his Indian blankets, the old Archbishop sat for a long while, looking at the open golden face of his cathedral. How exactly young Molny, his French architect, had done what he wanted. Nothing sensational, simply honest building and good stone-cutting, good Midi Romanesque of the plainest. And even now in winter, when the acacia trees before the door were bare, how it was of the South, that church, and how it sounded the note of the South. No one but Molny and the bishop had ever seemed to enjoy the beautiful sight of that building. Perhaps no one ever would. But these two had spent many an hour admiring it. The steep carnelian hills drew up so close behind the church that the individual pine trees thinly wooding their slopes were clearly visible. From the end of the street, where the bishop's buggy stood, the tawny church seemed to start directly out of those rose-colored hills, with a purpose so strong that it was like action. Seen from this distance, the cathedral lay against the pine-splashed slopes as against a curtain. When Bernard drove slowly nearer, the backbone of the hills sank gradually, and the towers rose clear into the blue air, while the body of the church still lay against the mountain. The young architect used to tell the bishop that only in Italy or in the opera did churches leap out of mountains and black pines like that. More than once Molny had called the bishop from his study to look at the unfinished building when a storm was coming up. Then the sky above the mountain grew black, and the carnelian rocks became an intense lavender, all their pine trees strokes of dark purple. The hills drew nearer, the whole background approached like a dark threat. "Setting," Molny used to tell Father Latour, "is accident. Either a building is part of a place, or it is not. Once that kinship is there, time will only make it stronger." The bishop was recalling this saying of Molny's when a voice out of the present sounded in his ear. It was Bernard. "A fine sunset, Father. See how red the mountains are growing. Sangre de Cristo." Yes, Sangre de Cristo. But no matter how scarlet the sunset, those red hills never became vermilion, but a more and more intense rose carnelian, not the colour of living blood, the bishop had often reflected, but the colour of the dried blood of saints and martyrs, preserved in old churches in Rome, which liquefies upon occasion. End of Book 9, Chapter 2. Book 9, Chapter 3 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The next morning Father Latour wakened with a grateful sense of nearness to his cathedral, which would also be his tomb. He felt safe under its shadow, like a boat come back to harbour, lying under its own sea-wall. He was in his old study. The sisters had sent a little iron bed from the school for him, and their finest linen and blankets. He felt a great content at being here, where he had come as a young man and where he had done his work. The room was little changed, the same rugs and skins on the earth floor, the same desk with his candlesticks, the same thick wavy white walls that muted sound, that shut out the world and gave repose to the spirit. As the darkness faded into the grey of a winter morning, he listened for the church bells, and for another sound that always amused him here, the whistle of a locomotive. Yes, he had come with the buffalo, and he had lived to see railway trains running into Santa Fe. He had accomplished an historic period. All his relatives at home and his friends in New Mexico had expected that the old archbishop would spend his closing years in France, probably in Clermont, where he could occupy a chair in his old college. That seemed the natural thing to do, and he had given it grave consideration. He had half expected to make some such arrangement the last time he was in Auvergne, just before his retirement from his duties as archbishop. But in the old world he found himself homesick for the new. It was a feeling he could not explain, a feeling that old age did not weigh so heavily upon a man in New Mexico as in the Puy de Dome. He loved the towering peaks of his native mountains, the comeliness of the villages, the cleanness of the countryside, the beautiful lines and the cloisters of his own college. Clermont was beautiful, but he found himself sad there. His heart lay like a stone in his breast. There was too much past, perhaps. When the summer wind stirred the lilacs in the old gardens and shook down the blooms of the horse-chestnuts, he sometimes closed his eyes and thought of the high song the wind was singing in the straight, striped pine trees up in the Navajo forests. During the day his nostalgia wore off, and by dinner-time it was quite gone. He enjoyed his dinner and his wine and the company of cultivated men, and usually retired in good spirits. It was in the early morning that he felt the ache in his breast. It had something to do with waking in the early morning. It seemed to him that the gray dawn lasted so long here. The country was a long while in coming to life. The gardens and the fields were damp, heavy mists hung in the valley and obscured the mountains. Hours went by before the sun could disperse those vapors and warm and purify the villages. In New Mexico he always awoke a young man. Not until he rose and began to shave did he realize that he was growing older. His first consciousness was a sense of the light, dry wind blowing in through the windows, with the fragrance of hot sun and sagebrush and sweet clover, a wind that made one's body feel light and one's heart cry, "Today, today," like a child's. Beautiful surroundings, the society of learned men, the charm of noble women, the graces of art, could not make up to him for the loss of those light-hearted mornings of the desert, for the wind that made one a boy again. He had noticed that this peculiar quality in the air of new countries vanished after they were tamed by man and made to bear harvests. Parts of Texas and Kansas that he had first known as open range had since been made into rich farming districts, and the air had quite lost that lightness, that dry aromatic odor. The moisture of plowed land, the heaviness of labor and growth and grain-bearing, utterly destroyed it. One could breathe that only on the bright edges of the world, on the great grass plains or the sagebrush desert. That air would disappear from the whole earth in time, perhaps, but long after his day. He did not know just when it had become so necessary to him, but he had come back to die in exile for the sake of it. Something soft and wild and free, something that whispered to the ear on the pillow, lightened the heart, softly, softly picked the lock, slid the bolts, and released the prisoned spirit of man into the wind, into the blue and gold, into the morning, into the morning. End of chapter 3. Book 9, Chapter 4, of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Father Latour arranged an order for his last days. If routine was necessary to him in health, it was even more so in sickness. Early in the morning, Bernard came with hot water, shaved him, and helped him to bathe. They had brought nothing in from the country with them but clothing and linen, and the silver toilet articles that Olivares had given the bishop so long ago. These 30 years he had washed his hands in that hammered basin. Morning prayers over, Magdalena came with his breakfast, and he sat in his easy-chair while she made his bed and arranged his room. Then he was ready to see visitors. The Archbishop came in for a few moments when he was at home, the Mother Superior, the American doctor. Bernard read aloud to him the rest of the morning, St. Augustine, or the letters of Madame de Sévigné, or his favorite, Pascal. Sometimes in the morning hours he dictated to his young disciple certain facts about the old missions in the diocese, facts which he had come upon by chance and feared would be forgotten. He wished he could do this systematically, but he had not the strength. Those truths and fancies relating to a bygone time would probably be lost. The old legends and customs and superstitions were already dying out. He wished now that long ago he had had the leisure to write them down, that he could have arrested their flight by throwing about them the light and elastic mesh of the French tongue. He had, indeed, for years directed the thoughts of the young priests whom he instructed to the fortitude and devotion of those first missionaries, the Spanish friars, declaring that his own life, when he first came to New Mexico, was one of ease and comfort compared with theirs. If he had used to be abroad for weeks together on short rations, sleeping in the open, unable to keep his body clean, at least he had the sense of being in a friendly world, where by every man's fireside a welcome awaited him. But the Spanish fathers who came up to Zuni then went north to the Navajos, west to the Hopis, east to all the pueblos scattered between Albuquerque and Taos. They came into a hostile country, carrying little provisionment but their breviary and crucifix. When their mules were stolen by Indians, as often happened, they proceeded on foot, without a change of raiment, without food or water. A European could scarcely imagine such hardships. The old countries were worn to the shape of human life, made into an investiture, a sort of second body for man. There the wild herbs and the wild fruits and the forest fungi were edible. The streams were sweet water, the trees afforded shade and shelter. But in the alkali deserts the water holes were poisonous, and the vegetation offered nothing to a starving man. Everything was dry, prickly, sharp: Spanish bayonet, juniper, greasewood, cactus, the lizard, the rattlesnake, and man made cruel by a cruel life. Those early missionaries threw themselves naked upon the hard heart of a country that was calculated to try the endurance of giants. They thirsted in its deserts, starved among its rocks, climbed up and down its terrible canyons on stone-bruised feet, broke long fasts by unclean and repugnant food. Surely these endured hunger, thirst, cold, nakedness, of a kind beyond any conception St. Paul and his brethren could have had. Whatever the early Christians suffered, it all happened in that safe little Mediterranean world, amid the old manners, the old landmarks. If they endured martyrdom, they died among their brethren. Their relics were piously preserved, their names lived in the mouths of holy men. Writing with his Alvergnates to the old missions that had been scenes of martyrdom, the bishop used to remind them that no man could know what triumphs of faith had happened there, where one white man met torture and death alone among so many infidels, or what visions and revelations God may have granted to soften that brutal end. When, as a young man, Father Latour first went down into Old Mexico to claim his see at the hands of the Bishop of Durango, he had met on his journey priests from the missions of Sonora and Lower California, who related many stories of the blessed experiences of the early Franciscan missionaries. Their way through the wilderness had blossomed with little miracles, it seemed. At one time, when the renowned Father Junipero Serra and his 2 companions were in danger of their lives from trying to cross a river at a treacherous point, a mysterious stranger appeared out of the rocks on the opposite shore, and calling to them in Spanish, told them to follow him to a point farther up the stream, where they forded in safety. When they begged to know his name, he evaded them and disappeared. At another time, they were traversing a great plain and were famished for water and almost spent. A young horseman overtook them and gave them 3 ripe pomegranates, then galloped away. This fruit not only quenched their thirst, but revived and strengthened them as much as the most nourishing food could have done, and they completed their journey like fresh men. One night in his travels through Durango, Father Latour was entertained at a great country estate, where the resident chaplain happened to be a priest from one of the Western missions, and he told a story of this same Father Junipero, which had come down in his own monastery from the old times. Father Junipero, he said, with a single companion, had once arrived at his monastery on foot without provisions. The brothers had welcomed the 2 in astonishment, believing it impossible that men could have crossed so great a stretch of desert in this naked fashion. The superior questioned them as to whence they had come. and said the mission should not have allowed them to set off without a guide and without food. He marveled how they could have got through alive. But Father Junipero replied that they had fared very well, and had been most agreeably entertained by a poor Mexican family on the way. At this, a muleteer, who was bringing in wood for the brothers, began to laugh, and said there was no house for 12 leagues, nor anyone at all living in the sandy waste through which they had come, and the brothers confirmed him in this. Then Father Junipero and his companion related fully their adventure. They had set out with bread and water for 1 day, but on the 2nd day they had been traveling since dawn across a cactus desert, and had begun to lose heart, when, near sunset, they espied in the distance 3 great cottonwood trees, very tall in the declining light. Toward these they hastened. As they approached the trees, which were large and green and were shedding cotton freely, they observed an ass tied to a dead trunk which stuck up out of the sand. Looking about for the owner of the ass, they came upon a little Mexican house with an oven by the door and strings of red peppers hanging on the wall. When they called aloud, a venerable Mexican, clad in sheepskins, came out and greeted them kindly, asking them to stay the night. Going in with him, they observed that all was neat and comely, and the wife, a young woman of beautiful countenance, was stirring porridge by the fire. Her child, scarcely more than an infant, and with no garment but his little shirt, was on the floor beside her, playing with a pet lamb. They found these people gentle, pious, and well-spoken. The husband said they were shepherds. The priest sat at their table and shared their supper, and afterward read the evening prayers. They had wished to question the host about the country and about his mode of life, and where he found pasture for his flock. But they were overcome by a great and sweet weariness, and taking each a sheepskin provided him, they lay down upon the floor and sank into deep sleep. When they awoke in the morning, they found all as before, and food set upon the table. But the family were absent, even to the pet lamb, having gone, the fathers supposed, to care for their flock. When the brothers at the monastery heard this account, they were amazed, declaring that there were indeed 3 cottonwood trees growing together in the desert, a well-known landmark, but that if a settler had come, he must have come very lately. So Father Junipero and Father Andrea, his companion, with some of the brothers and the scoffing muleteer, went back into the wilderness to prove the matter. The 3 tall trees they found, shedding their cotton, and the dead trunk to which the ass had been tied. But the ass was not there, nor any house, nor the oven by the door. Then the 2 fathers sank down upon their knees in that blessed spot and kissed the earth, for they perceived what family it was that had entertained them there. Father Junipero confessed to the brothers how from the moment he entered the house he had been strangely drawn to the child, and desired to take him in his arms, but that he kept near his mother. When the priest was reading the evening prayers, the child sat upon the floor against his mother's knee, with the lamb in his lap, and the father found it hard to keep his eyes upon his breviary. After prayers, when he bade his hosts good night, he did indeed stoop over the little boy in blessing, and the child had lifted his hand, and with his tiny finger made the cross upon Father Junipero's forehead. This story of Father Junipero's holy family made a strong impression upon the bishop, when it was told him by the fireside of that great hacienda where he was a guest for the night. He had such an affection for that story, indeed, that he had allowed himself to repeat it on but 2 occasions, once to the nuns of Mother Filomena's convent in Riom, and once at a dinner given by Cardinal Mazzucchi in Rome. There is always something charming in the idea of greatness returning to simplicity, the queen making hay among the country girls. But how much more endearing was the belief that they, after so many centuries of history and glory, should return to play their first parts in the persons of a humble Mexican family, the lowliest of the lowly, the poorest of the poor, in a wilderness at the end of the world, where the angels could scarcely find them. End of chapter 4. Book 9, Chapter 5 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. After his déjeuner, the old Archbishop made a pretense of sleeping. He requested not to be disturbed until dinner time, and those long hours of solitude were precious to him. His bed was at the dark end of the room, where the shadows were restful to his eyes. On fair days, the other end was full of sunlight. On gray days, the light of the fire flickered along the wavy white walls. Lying so still that the bedclothes over his body scarcely moved, with his hands resting delicately on the sheet beside him or upon his breast, the bishop was living over his life. When he was otherwise motionless, the thumb of his right hand would sometimes gently touch a ring on his forefinger, an amethyst with an inscription cut upon it, Auspice Maria, Father Vaillant's signet ring. And then he was almost certainly thinking of Joseph, of their life together here, in this room, in Ohio beside the Great Lakes, as young men in Paris, as boys at Montferrand. There were many passages in their missionary life that he loved to recall, and how often and how fondly he recalled the beginning of it. They were both young men in their 20s, curates to older priests, when there came to Claremont a bishop from Ohio, a native of Auvergne, looking for volunteers for his missions in the West. Father Jean and Father Joseph heard him lecture at the seminary and talked with him in private. Before he left for the North, they had pledged themselves to meet him in Paris at a given date, to spend some weeks of preparation at the College for Foreign Missions in the Rue du Bac, and then to sail with him from Cherbourg. Both the young priests knew that their families would strongly oppose their purpose, so they resolved to reveal it to no one, to make no adieux, but to steal away disguised in civilians' clothes. They comforted each other by recalling that St. Francis Xavier, when he set forth as missionary to India, had stolen away like this, had passed the dwelling of his parents without saluting them, as they had learned at school. Terrible words to a French boy. Father Vaillant's position was especially painful. His father was a stern, silent man, long a widower, who loved his children with a jealous passion, and had no life but in their lives. Joseph was the eldest child. The period between his resolve and its execution was a period of anguish for him. As the date set for their departure drew near, he grew thinner and paler than ever. By agreement, the two friends were to meet at dawn in a certain field outside Riom on the fateful day, and there await the diligence for Paris. Jean Latour, having made his decision and pledged himself, knew no wavering. On the appointed morning he stole out of his sister's house and took his way through the sleeping town to that mountain field, tip-tilted by reason of its steepness, just beginning to show a cold green in the heavy light of a cloudy daybreak. There he found his comrade in a miserable plight. Joseph had been abroad in the fields all night, wandering up and down, finding his purpose and losing it. His face was swollen with weeping. He shook with a chill. His voice was beyond his control. "What shall I do, Jean? Help me," he cried. "I cannot break my father's heart, and I cannot break the vow I have made to heaven. I had rather die than do either. Ah, if I could but die of this misery, here, now." How clearly the old Archbishop could recall the scene. Those two young men in the fields in the grey morning, disguised as if they were criminals, escaping by stealth from their homes. He had not known how to comfort his friend. It seemed to him that Joseph was suffering more than flesh could bear, that he was actually being torn in two by conflicting desires. While they were pacing up and down, arm in arm, they heard a hollow sound, the diligence rumbling down the mountain gorge. Joseph stood still and buried his face in his hands. The postilion's horn sounded. "Allons," said Jean lightly. "L'invitation du voyage. You will accompany me to Paris. Once we are there, if your father is not reconciled, we will get Bishop F. to absolve you from your promise, and you can return to Riom. It is very simple." He ran to the roadside and waved to the driver. The coach stopped. In a moment they were off, and before long Joseph had fallen asleep in his seat from sheer exhaustion. But he always said that if Jean Latour had not supported him in that hour of torment, he would have been a parish priest in the Puy des Dômes for the rest of his life. Of the two young priests who set forth from Riom that morning in early spring, Jean Latour had seemed the one so much more likely to succeed in a missionary's life. He indeed had a sound mind in a sound body. During the weeks they spent at the College of Foreign Missions in the Rue du Bac, the authorities had been very doubtful of Joseph's fitness for the hardships of the mission field. Yet in the long test of years, it was that frail body that had endured more and accomplished more. Father Latour often said that his diocese changed little except in boundaries. The Mexicans were always Mexicans. The Indians were always Indians. Santa Fe was a quiet backwater with no natural wealth, no importance commercially. But Father Vaillant had been plunged into the midst of a great industrial expansion, where guile and trickery and honorable ambition all struggled together, a territory that developed by leaps and bounds and then experienced ruinous reverses. Every year, even after he was crippled, he traveled thousands of miles by stage and in his carriage among the mountain towns that were now rich, now poor, and deserted. Boulder, Gold Hill, Caribou, Cache-à-la-Poudre, Spanish Bar, South Park, up the Arkansas to Cache Creek and California Gulch. And Father Vaillant had not been content to be a mere missionary priest. He became a promoter. He saw a great future for the church in Colorado. While he was still so poor that he could not have a rectory of ordinary comfort to live in, he began buying up great tracts of land for the church. He was able to buy a great deal of land for very little money, but that little had to be borrowed from banks at a ruinous rate of interest. He borrowed money to build schools and convents, and the interest on his debts ate him up. He made long begging trips through Ohio and Pennsylvania and Canada to raise money to pay this interest, which grew like a rolling snowball. He formed a land company, went abroad and floated bonds in France to raise money, and dishonest brokers brought reproach upon his name. When he was nearly 70, with one leg 4 inches shorter than the other, Father Vaillant, then first Bishop of Colorado, was summoned to Rome to explain his complicated finance before the papal court, and he had very hard work to satisfy the cardinals. When a dispatch was flashed into Santa Fe announcing Bishop Vaillant's death, Father Latour at once took the new railroad for Denver, but he could scarcely believe the telegram. He recalled the old nickname, Trompe la Mort, and remembered how many times before he had hurried across mountains and deserts, not daring to hope he would find his friend alive. Curiously, Father Latour could never feel that he had actually been present at Father Joseph's funeral. Or rather, he could not believe that Father Joseph was there. The shriveled little old man in the coffin, scarcely larger than a monkey, that had nothing to do with Father Vaillant. He could see Joseph as clearly as he could see Bernard, but always as he was when they first came to New Mexico. It was not sentiment. That was the picture of Father Joseph his memory produced for him, and it did not produce any other. The funeral itself he liked to remember as a recognition. It was held under canvas in the open air. There was not a building in Denver, in the whole far west for that matter, big enough for his Blanchet's funeral. For 2 days before, the populations of villages and mining camps had been streaming down the mountains. They slept in wagons and tents and barns. They made a throng, like a national convention, in the convent square. And a strange thing happened at that funeral. Father Revardy, the French priest who had gone from Santa Fe to Colorado with Father Vaillant more than 20 years before, and had been with him ever since as his curate and vicar, had been sent to France on business for his bishop. While there, he was told by his physician that he had a fatal malady, and he at once took ship and hurried homeward to make his report to Bishop Vaillant and to die in the harness. When he got as far as Chicago, he had an acute seizure and was taken to a Catholic hospital, where he lay very ill. One morning a nurse happened to leave a newspaper near his bed. Glancing at it, Father Revardy saw an announcement of the death of the Bishop of Colorado. When the sister returned, she found her patient dressed. He convinced her that he must be driven to the railway station at once. On reaching Denver, he entered a carriage and asked to be taken to the bishop's funeral. He arrived there when the services were nearly half over, and no one ever forgot the sight of this dying man, supported by the cab driver and 2 priests, making his way through the crowd and dropping upon his knees beside the bier. A chair was brought for him, and for the rest of the ceremony he sat with his forehead resting against the edge of the coffin. When Bishop Vaillant was carried away to his tomb, Father Revardy was taken to the hospital, where he died a few days later. It was one more instance of the extraordinary personal devotion that Father Joseph had so often aroused and retained so long in red men and yellow men and white. End of chapter 5. Book 9, Chapter 6 of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa, Cather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. During those last weeks of the bishop's life, he thought very little about death. It was the past he was leaving. The future would take care of itself. But he had an intellectual curiosity about dying, about the changes that took place in a man's beliefs and scale of values. More and more, life seemed to him an experience of the ego, in no sense the ego itself. This conviction, he believed, was something apart from his religious life. It was an enlightenment that came to him as a man, a human creature, and he noticed that he judged conduct differently now, his own and that of others. The mistakes of his life seemed unimportant, accidents that had occurred en route, like the shipwreck in Galveston Harbor, or the runaway in which he was hurt when he was first on his way to New Mexico in search of his bishopric. He observed also that there was no longer any perspective in his memories. He remembered his winters with his cousins on the Mediterranean when he was a little boy, his student days in the Holy City, as clearly as he remembered the arrival of Monsieur Molny and the building of his cathedral. He was soon to have done with calendared time, and it had already ceased to count for him. He sat in the middle of his own consciousness. None of his former states of mind were lost or outgrown. They were all within reach of his hand, and all comprehensible. Sometimes, when Magdalena or Bernard came in and asked him a question, it took him several seconds to bring himself back to the present. He could see they thought his mind was failing, but it was only extraordinarily active in some other part of the great picture of his life, some part of which they knew nothing. When the occasion warranted, he could return to the present, but there was not much present left. Father Joseph dead, the Olivares both dead, Kit Carson dead. Only the minor characters of his life remained in present time. One morning, several weeks after the bishop came back to Santa Fe, one of the strong people of the old deep days of life did appear, not in memory but in the flesh, in the shallow light of the present, El Sabio the Navajo. Out on the Colorado Chiquito he had heard the word, passed on from one trading post to another, that the old Archbishop was failing, and the Indian came to Santa Fe. He too was an old man now. Once again their fine hands clasped. The bishop brushed a drop of moisture from his eye. "I have wished for this meeting, my friend. I had thought of asking you to come, but it is a long way." The old Navajo smiled. "Not long now any more. I come on the cars, Padre. I get on the cars at Gallup, and the same day I am here. You remember when we came together once to Santa Fe from my country, how long it take us? 2 weeks, pretty near. Men travel faster now, but I do not know if they go to better things." "We must not try to know the future, El Sabio. It is better not. And Manuelito?" "Manuelito is well. He still leads his people." El Sabio did not stay long, but he said he would come again tomorrow, as he had business in Santa Fe that would keep him for some days. He had no business there, but when he looked at Father Latour, he said to himself, "It will not be long." After he was gone, the bishop turned to Bernard. "My son, I have lived to see 2 great wrongs righted. I have seen the end of black slavery, and I have seen the Navajos restored to their own country." For many years Father Latour used to wonder if there would ever be an end to the Indian wars, while there was one Navajo or Apache left alive. Too many traders and manufacturers made a rich profit out of that warfare. A political machine and immense capital were employed to keep it going. Chapter 7. The bishop's middle years in New Mexico had been clouded by the persecution of the Navajos and their expulsion from their own country. Through his friendship with El Sabio, he had become interested in the Navajos soon after he first came to his new diocese, and he admired them. They stirred his imagination. Though this nomad people were much slower to adopt white man's ways than the home-staying Indians who dwelt in pueblos, and were much more indifferent to missionaries and the white man's religion, Father Latour felt a superior strength in them. There was purpose and conviction behind their inscrutable reserve, something active and quick, something with an edge. The expulsion of the Navajos from their country, which had been theirs no man knew how long, had seemed to him an injustice that cried to heaven. Never could he forget that terrible winter when they were being hunted down and driven by thousands from their own reservation to the Bosque Redondo, 300 miles away on the Pecos River. Hundreds of them, men, women, and children, perished from hunger and cold on the way. Their sheep and horses died from exhaustion crossing the mountains. None ever went willingly. They were driven by starvation and the bayonet, captured in isolated bands, and brutally deported. It was his own misguided friend, Kit Carson, who finally subdued the last unconquered remnant of that people, who followed them into the depths of the Canyon de Chelly, whither they had fled from their grazing plains and pine forests to make their last stand. They were shepherds, with no property but their livestock, encumbered by their women and children, poorly armed, and with scanty ammunition. But this canyon had always before proved impenetrable to white troops. The Navajos believed it could not be taken. They believed that their old gods dwelt in the fastnesses of that canyon. Like their ship rock, it was an inviolate place, the very heart and center of their life. Carson followed them down into the hidden world between those towering walls of red sandstone, spoiled their stores, destroyed their deep-sheltered cornfields, cut down the terraced peach orchards so dear to them. When they saw all that was sacred to them laid waste, the Navajos lost heart. They did not surrender. They simply ceased to fight and were taken. Carson was a soldier under orders, and he did a soldier's brutal work. But the bravest of the Navajo chiefs he did not capture, even after the crushing defeat of his people in the Cañon de Chelly. Manuelito was still at large. It was then that Eusebio came to Santa Fe to ask Bishop Latour to meet Manuelito at Zuni. As a priest, the bishop knew that it was indiscreet to consent to a meeting with this outlawed chief, but he was a man, too, and a lover of justice. The request came to him in such a way that he could not refuse it. He went with Eusebio. Though the government was offering a heavy reward for his person, living or dead, Manuelito rode off his own reservation down into Zuni in broad daylight, attended by some dozen followers, all on wretched, half-starved horses. He had been hiding out in Eusebio's country on the Colorado Chiquito. It was Manuelito's hope that the bishop would go to Washington and plead his people's cause before they were utterly destroyed. They asked nothing of the government, he told Father Latour, but their religion and their own land, where they had lived from immemorial times. Their country, he explained, was a part of their religion. The two were inseparable. The Cañon de Chelly, the Padre knew. In that canyon his people had lived when they were a small, weak tribe. It had nourished and protected them. It was their mother. Moreover, their gods dwelt there, in those inaccessible white houses set in caverns up in the face of the cliffs, which were older than white man's world, and which no living man had ever entered. Their gods were there, just as the Padre's God was in his church. And north of the Cañon de Chelly was the Ship Rock, a slender crag rising to a dizzy height, all alone out on a flat desert. Seen at a distance of 50 miles or so, that crag presented the figure of a one-masted fishing boat under full sail, and the white man named it accordingly. But the Indian has another name. He believes that rock was once a ship of the air. Ages ago, Manuelito told the bishop, that crag had moved through the air, bearing upon its summit the parents of the Navajo race from the place in the far north where all peoples were made, and wherever it sank to earth was to be their land. It sank in a desert country, where it was hard for men to live, but they had found the Cañon de Chelly, where there was shelter and unfailing water. That canyon and the Ship Rock were like kind parents to his people, places more sacred to them than churches, more sacred than any place is to the white man. How then could they go 300 miles away and live in a strange land? Moreover, the Bosque Redondo was down on the Pecos, far east of the Rio Grande. Manuelito drew a map in the sand and explained to the bishop how, from the very beginning, it had been enjoined that his people must never cross the Rio Grande on the east, or the Rio San Juan in the north, or the Rio Colorado in the west. If they did, the tribe would perish. If a great priest like Father Latour were to go to Washington and explain these things, perhaps the government would listen. Father Latour tried to tell the Indian that in a Protestant country the one thing a Roman priest could not do was to interfere in matters of government. Manuelito listened respectfully, but the bishop saw that he did not believe him. When he had finished, the Navajo rose and said, "You are the friend of Cristobal, who hunts my people and drives them over the mountains to the Bosque Redondo. Tell your friend that he will never take me alive. He can come and kill me when he pleases. 2 years ago I could not count my flocks. Now I have 30 sheep and a few starving horses. My children are eating roots, and I do not care for my life. But my mother and my gods are in the west, and I will never cross the Rio Grande." He never did cross it. He lived in hiding until the return of his exiled people. For an unforeseen thing happened. The Bosque Redondo proved an utterly unsuitable country for the Navajos. It could have been farmed by irrigation, but they were nomad shepherds, not farmers. There was no pasture for their flocks. There was no firewood. They dug mesquite roots and dried them for fuel. It was an alkaline country, and hundreds of Indians died from bad water. At last, the government at Washington admitted its mistake, which governments seldom do. After 5 years of exile, the remnant of the Navajo people were permitted to go back to their sacred places. In 1875, the bishop took his French architect on a pack trip into Arizona to show him something of the country before he returned to France, and he had the pleasure of seeing the Navajo horsemen riding free over their great plains again. The two Frenchmen went as far as the Canyon de Chelly to behold the strange cliff ruins. Once more crops were growing down at the bottom of the world between the towering sandstone walls. Sheep were grazing under the magnificent cottonwoods and drinking at the streams of sweet water. It was like an Indian Garden of Eden. Now, when he was an old man and ill, scenes from those bygone times, dark and bright, flashed back to the bishop, the terrible faces of the Navajos waiting at the place on the Rio Grande where they were being ferried across into exile. The long streams of survivors going back to their own country, driving their scanty flocks, carrying their old men and their children. Memories, too, of that time he had spent with Eusebio on the little Colorado in the early spring, when the lambing season was not yet over. Dark horsemen riding across the sands with orphan lambs in their arms. A young Navajo woman giving a lamb her breast until a ewe was found for it. "Bernard," the old bishop would murmur, "God has been very good to let me live to see a happy issue to those old wrongs. I do not believe, as I once did, that the Indian will perish. I believe that God will preserve him." Chapter 8. The American doctor was consulting with Archbishop S. and the Mother Superior. "It is his heart that is the trouble now. I have been giving him small doses to stimulate it, but they no longer have any effect. I scarcely dare increase them. It might be fatal at once, but that is why you see such a change in him." The change was that the old man did not want food, and that he slept, or seemed to sleep, nearly all the time. On the last day of his life his condition was pretty generally known. The cathedral was full of people all day long praying for him, nuns and old women, young men and girls, coming and going. The sick man had received the viaticum early in the morning. Some of the Tesuque Indians, who had been his country neighbors, came into Santa Fe and sat all day in the Archbishop's courtyard, listening for news of him. With them was Eusebio the Navajo. Fructosa and Tranquilino, his old servants, were with the supplicants in the cathedral. The Mother Superior and Magdalena and Bernard attended the sick man. There was little to do but to watch and pray, so peaceful and painless was his repose. Sometimes it was sleep, they knew from his relaxed features. Then his face would assume personality, consciousness, even though his eyes did not open. Toward the close of day, in the short twilight after the candles were lighted, the old bishop seemed to become restless, moved a little, and began to murmur. It was in the French tongue, but Bernard, though he caught some words, could make nothing of them. He knelt beside the bed. "What is it, Father? I am here." He continued to murmur, to move his hands a little, and Magdalena thought he was trying to ask for something or to tell them something. But in reality the bishop was not there at all. He was standing in the tip-tilted green field among his native mountains, and he was trying to give consolation to a young man who was being torn in two before his eyes by the desire to go and the necessity to stay. He was trying to forge a new will in that devout and exhausted priest, and the time was short, for the diligence for Paris was already rumbling down the mountain gorge. When the cathedral bell tolled just after dark, the Mexican population of Santa Fe fell upon their knees, and all American Catholics as well. Many others who did not kneel prayed in their hearts. El Sabio and the Tesuque boys went quietly away to tell their people, and the next morning the old Archbishop lay before the high altar in the church he had built. End of chapter 8. End of Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. Read by Carol Pelster.